Chapter 1103. The Tang army soon calmed down after a short commotion. They set up the tents and the battle array was ready. From the generals to the soldiers, they all knew that the Taoist coalition army came out of the city to cooperate with the defense, not because they had the guts to attack the Tang army before they had a firm foothold. The Tang army was still confident, but they were not less vigilant. More and more reports came from Yangzhou. The divine halls of West Hill had sent more divine priests to the coalition army. The Imperial Center Administration and the tactical array masters in the Tang army might be able to resist the divine priests' divine skills. But who could stop Hengmu Liren? The young and legendary great divine priest of West Hill had recovered from his wounds a few days ago. A super-powerful figure like him was powerful enough to decide the outcome of the war. If no one could stop him, he could easily wipe out the cultivators in the Tang army with the help of the cavalrymen of the divine halls. As long as he killed all the tactical array masters and talisman masters, the cavalrymen of the divine halls would launch a surprise attack. How could the Tang army defeat them? Today, when the Tang army was approaching, the lords of the aristocratic families and the generals of the South Jin Kingdom on the city wall of Yangzhou were calm and orderly. Obviously, they knew that as long as Hengmu Liren was here, the coalition army would never lose and Yangzhou would never fall. Then there was nothing to worry about. In front of the central tent of the Tang army, dozens of cavalrymen were standing on the meadow and looking at the direction of Yangzhou. In fact, those generals were all looking at Ning Quebec. It seemed that the key to the war was the battle between him and Hengmu. Nobody believed that Ning Ke could kill Hengmu Liren. Even though he was Mr. 13 of the academy and had an unimaginably high position in the hearts of the Tang army and people, the killer was Hengmu Liren, the son of Haotian. They only hoped that Ning Ke could defeat or even stall Hengmu Liren, so that Hengmu Liren would not affect the battle before the Tang cavalry was sure of the victory. Ning Ke seemed to be unaware of their gazes. He quietly looked at the city of Yangzhou, the fields outside the city, the official road between the fields, and the green trees on both sides of the road. Perhaps it was because Hengmu Liren did not want his view to be obstructed. The corpses of the followers of the new stream and the young people who were loyal to the old Tang were not hung in the fields. Because of the war and the purge, the farmers were not in the mood to farm, so the fields were abandoned. There were no seedlings in front of the city of Yangzhou, only weeds and wildflowers. Ning Ke could not remember if it was late spring or early summer. Looking at the flowers in the smoke and feeling the wild prosperity, he suddenly thought of a saying. Fireworks in Yangzhou in March. He murmured. Song Qian and the others were severely injured by Hengmu Liren. They could not stand up no matter how much medicine they took. They were left in the verdant canyon to recover. Wang Qi was the only disciple of the academy who followed Ning Ke to the battlefield today. Wang Qi shook his head and said, "The flowering season is already the 5th month." Ning Ke recalled that it was snowing when he left Chang'an. Time passed too fast. He could not help but sigh and said, "I don't have the energy to remember these things." Time was the most important thing. But he had to go to the wilderness in the north and the Qinghe River in the south. He had to kill many difficult people and make many difficult decisions. Those things seemed to be more important than time. 11th brother, I'll go first. Ning Ke said to Wang Qi. Wang Qi looked at him worriedly and said, "Don't force yourself if you can't succeed." Ning Ke smiled and lifted the reins. The big black horse slowly lifted its hooves and trod on the fertile fields. Along the way, the weeds were bent and the wildflowers were broken. It was heading toward the city of Yangzhou. A single rider arrived at Yangzhou city, attracting dozens of sparse arrows. The big black horse looked at the enemies on the city wall with an indifferent expression. It probably thought it was boring. Ning Ke did not dodge and watched the arrows fall on the field in front. Someone looked at the handsome black horse and the man dressed in a black academy uniform on its back and finally remembered the descriptions in the rumors. He immediately lost his head in panic and shouted loudly. Ning Ke! Mr. 13. The academy is here. Recognizing Ning Ke, the people on the city wall of Yangzhou were in an uproar. There were people moving everywhere and the sound of heavy shields moving was deafening. The prideful red-robed clerics instantly paled. They waved their arms and screamed, "Quickly report this to the divine seat." Bai Haixin had died in front of the verdant canyon a few years ago. The current commander-in-chief of the South Jin Kingdom was his brother-in-law, Dong Wei. Dong Wei, who was usually calm and confident in front of his subordinates, had already hidden behind 3 layers of shields. Looking at the iron bow on Ning Ke's shoulder, his body trembled uncontrollably, and his voice trembled violently. "Mr. 13, please wait. The great divine priest will be here soon." The entire human world knew how powerful and terrifying Ning Ke was. Just like how the Tangs were worried about Henmu Liren, Ning Ke's name was also a terrifying deterrent to the enemies of the Tang Empire. Fortunately, the iron bow was resting on his shoulder quietly. Otherwise, Dong Wei and the priests in red would not even dare to shout. Even if they could shout, they would not shout for a fight. They would just say that the great divine priest would be here soon and that they should wait for a moment. For the people in the human world, powerful cultivators like Ning Ke and Henmu were no different from immortals. Since there was going to be a fight between immortals today, why would they, as immortals, bring about their own destruction? The news that Ning Ke had arrived at the city of Yangzhou reached Henmu Liren's ears in the shortest time possible. His innocent face revealed a sincere smile and he said with relief, "Finally, you are here." A priest was reporting the latest military intelligence to the divine halls in a low voice. He told the divine halls of West Hill about the collapse of the Golden Tribe royal court and how Ning Ke defeated 10,000 cavalries in the city of Wei with 1 arrow. Then he begged the great divine priest with a trembling voice not to underestimate the enemy. Henmu Liren laughed innocently and satisfyingly. He murmured, "So what if he is powerful? He is just a mortal after all, while I am the real son of God." Yes, he thought that he was the real son of West Hill and Long Qing was not qualified to be mentioned in the same breath with him. If it were not for Long Qing's silence, he would have made Long Qing the only one in the world. "Ning Ke, I will meet you outside the city." Henmu Liren looked to the north and said slowly. His childish voice condensed into a beam and stirred up the layers of gauze in front of the sedan. It flew over 10 miles and exploded in the fields outside the city like thunder in spring. Boom! Many soldiers on the city of Yangzhou almost fainted because of the thunder. They managed to hold their bodies and not fall down. When they came to their senses, they were all cheering. The great divine priest's casual words were like the power of heaven. His state was way beyond the human realm. No matter how powerful Mr. 13 from the academy was, how could he defeat the great divine priest? Ning Ke lowered his head and looked at the wild flowers in the fields calmly. The big black horse lowered its head and chewed on a wild flower. It did not taste good and spat it out, as if it did not hear the thunder at all. "Meet me outside the city." He looked up at the city of Yangzhou and said, "I am the owner of this place. I can meet you however I want." He did not use the Great Spirit on purpose. He just said it normally, so his words were not as powerful as Henmu Liren's. But he knew that Henmu Liren could hear him. After that, he took out a handful of meatballs and stuffed them into the big black horse's mouth. The big black horse did not dare to disobey. It chewed the meatballs with a bitter face and swallowed them as fast as it could. Then it lowered its head and chewed on the grass with dew on it so that it would not be affected by the smell. The meatballs were concocted by Wang Qi. They were very effective but tasteless. Ning Ke also ate a handful of meatballs. He looked at the cavalrymen of the divine halls of West Hill and the South Jin Kingdom below the city of Yangzhou. He stroked the big black horse's hair and said, "You came from the Southern Battlefront Army and left the military ministry because I chose you outside the academy. You should be a warhorse no matter how I look at it." The big black horse nodded in agreement. He said, "You and I have been to many places and fought against many enemies. But in fact, we have never been to a real battlefield. I came from a cavalryman and you came from a warhorse. Don't you feel regretful?" The big black horse wanted to say that he did not feel regretful, but he did not dare to. Moreover, he could feel the effects of the meatballs spreading in his body. He felt that his blood was heating up and he wanted to sprint wildly. Was this the feeling of being hot-blooded? He remembered the last time he had such a feeling and impulse. It was many years ago when he saw the coquettish and beautiful big white mare in the left king's palace racing competition in the wilderness. The big black horse's breathing became rough and rapid, and it kept breathing out hot air. Ning Kai untied the iron bow and casually pulled it to the fullest. He aimed in the direction of Yangzhou city. There were countless pairs of eyes watching him from above and below the city walls. Even if it was the slightest movement, at least half of them were probably staring at his shoulder, at the dark iron bow. When he pulled the iron bow and aimed at Yangzhou city, there was a sudden uproar and countless screams of panic. The leaders of the clans and the generals of the coalition army knew the terror of the primordial 13 arrows the best. They were the most vigilant and watched closely. Therefore, they reacted the fastest. Countless swishing sounds could be heard. Countless people hugged their heads and squatted down. They looked like weeds that had been blown down by the wind. Of course, the weeds were not strong. The cavalrymen in front of the city gate felt like they were falling into the abyss of death even though they were only being pointed at by the arrowhead. Some of them desperately whipped their mounts. Some were so distracted that they forgot to move and let their mounts drag them to the side. In a short period of time, there was a large empty space. There was nothing between Ning Kai's arrow and the gate of Yangzhou. There was nothing to block it. He released the bowstring. He did not use the primordial 13 arrows, but an ordinary arrow. With a swoosh, the arrow landed on the city gate of Yangzhou city that had been built for less than 2 years. The gate was extremely thick. The sharp arrowhead penetrated half a foot into the gate, but it still could not penetrate it. The arrow seemed to have lost its momentum and stopped moving forward. It began to vibrate violently. The tail of the arrow rubbed against the air at a high speed, producing a dull and frightening buzzing sound. Buzz, the arrow pierced deeply into the thick city gate. As it vibrated at such a terrifying speed, the place where it touched began to soften. In the next moment, there was even a thin crack. At the moment when the arrow fell on the city gate, Ning Kai moved. An arrogant neigh tore through the quiet sky outside Yangzhou city. The big black horse did not stand on its hind legs. It lowered its head and stomped its hind hooves on the ground. The soft field was shaken by its stomps, causing 2 extremely exaggerated muddy rains and a large cloud of dust. The muddy rain and dust continued to rise, covering the eyes of the Tang army. When the dust settled and they looked at the field again, they found that the big black horse was already 1,000 feet away. 1,000 feet away in an instant. What a terrifying speed! Looking at the straight line of dust in the field and the big black horse sprinting at the front like lightning, everyone was silent. Yangzhou city was close. A cavalry commander of the West Hill Divine Hall shouted and tried to stop it with a talisman knife in his hand. Ning Kai did not even look at him, and neither did the big black horse. The shout turned into a scream. The cavalry commander was shaken into the sky. Blood gushed out from his neck and the depths of his armor. It was a rain of blood. Yangzhou city was closer. A sword master from the South Jin Kingdom pulled out his sword and wanted to launch a sneak attack. Although he was not a disciple of the sword Garrett, he had learned some sword style from the sword Garrett. He was particular about a foot in front of the body, so he held his sword tightly. He wanted to use his sword at the most powerful moment. The big black horse crashed into his body. The sword master from the South Jin Kingdom did not have time to draw his sword because the big black horse was too fast. It was so fast that it was beyond his imagination and all his calculations. It was even several times faster than his sword. A foot in front of the body. His sword was knocked back by the big black horse just as he was unsheathed. With a swish, the sword master from the South Jin Kingdom's body was cut in half. He was cut in half by his own sword. The big black horse rushed into the 100,000 cavalrymen with a violent cloud of dust. It was so duty-bound, righteous, and fearless. Because its blood was hot. Of course, if it had not taken those pills, it might not have been so resolute. The cloud of dust was straight, and the black lightning lit up the entire field. In front of that straight line, countless figures were shaken into the sky. Bang, bang, bang. The hard armor was deflated. Boom, boom, boom. The sharp swords and knives were broken. Yangzhou was really close. The Allied cavalry finally organized an effective defensive formation. Several long spears were pointed at the front. The sharp and poisonous spear tips shone with a chilling luster under the sunlight. Ning Ke stared at the arrow that was still shaking violently on the city gate and said, "Rise." The big black horse neighed and leaped into the sky. Time seemed to stop at this moment. On the horse's back, Ning Ke punched the tail of the arrow. Countless cracks appeared on the thick city gate in an instant, densely packed like a spider web. Crack, 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 crack. The city gate collapsed. The big black horse landed, lighter than a swallow. Several terrifying spears had already been left behind. It did not slow down and continued to rush forward like a black ghost. They entered Yangzhou. I wrote for the whole day today and only wrote 4,000 words. I almost threw up. Mom was shocked when she heard the sound of me retching. She thought something was wrong with me. Actually, my body is fine. It's all mental problems. Is my writing so bad that I feel like throwing up while writing? I really want to curse. I thought I would have to write about life and family relationships with Hengmu today. So I'll leave it for tomorrow. I hope I can write more tomorrow. Anyway, I'm talking about recovering today and breaking out tomorrow. If I can't break out tomorrow, well, I'll tell everyone who the culprit is. Chapter 1104. Countless pairs of eyes watched the big black horse break into the enemy's camp like lightning and then enter Yangzhou like a wisp of smoke. There were the Tang army, bigwigs from the warlords in the city, the dead in the Fujian River, and the dead hanging on the trees on the bridge. Many of them died with their eyes wide open. They finally closed their eyes when they saw Ning Quebec. There was a long straight road behind the city gate of Yangzhou. The big black horse galloped southward and traveled a few miles in an instant. The sound of hooves slowed down. That was Ning Ke's reply to the dead in Qinghe Prefecture. In the middle of the street thousands of feet away, there was a huge sacred sedan. The gauze curtain was fluttering in the warm spring breeze, revealing the face of the young great divine priest. He was still calm with a cruel smile. "You are in such a hurry. It seems that the wind and thunder are unstoppable. But I think it is not the demeanor of the academy." Hengmu Liren looked at him and said. Ning Ke got off the horse and did not answer. He reached his right hand behind his shoulder and held the hilt of his blade. He walked toward the sacred sedan. It was thousands of feet away from the sacred sedan. It would take him 1,000 steps to walk slowly. According to your fighting style, you never give your opponent too much time to prepare. So who are you going to leave the 1,000 steps for? For yourself? It seems that you know how the battle will go. Hengmu Liren smiled with satisfaction and said, "It is not surprising that you can defeat Ada easily in the wilderness. Because talisman masters are naturally invincible. Moreover, you have the ability of the academy. Besides, you are also a cultivator of diabolism. You are already one of the most powerful cultivators in the cultivation world. Unfortunately, none of these means anything to me. While talking, Ning Ke had already walked dozens of steps forward. Hunmu Liren stopped smiling and stared at the approaching figure. A trace of anger flashed across his tender eyes and he said coldly, "Talisman masters are invincible in the same state. Talisman masters below the 5 states are naturally invincible. Even so, so what? You should know that I have already surpassed the 5 states. How can you defeat me?" Ning Ke still did not say anything. He held the hilt and walked forward in silence. Hunmu Liren did not look down on him because of his silence. On the contrary, he looked more solemn. He leaned forward and then sat up straight. He said seriously, "Of course, I admit that you are powerful enough. Today's battle, no matter who wins, will shake the entire world just like the Battle of Verdant Canyon years ago. It will be recorded in of history. So I am grateful that you are here." Ning of Hunmu Liren was powerful enough to show his strength. Of his absolute confidence of gratitude. But of Hunmu Liren did not agree. He felt that the battle on the street of Yangzhou today was not similar to the Battle of Verdant Canyon. He might be able to compete with second brother now, but Hunmu was not qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as Liu Bai. Eyes of Hunmu of Liren was of Tian of Haotian. Of heaven of. Liu Bai was the most powerful one who dared to draw his sword against Haotian. He was the most powerful one in the world. Ning Ke remained silent. Hunmu Liren was finally displeased. His solemn expression was mixed with anger. He thought that there should be some sympathy between him and Ning Quebec. However, Ning Ke did not answer him, which made him feel ignored. "Are you confident that you can defeat me?" He looked at Ning Ke and said sarcastically. "No." Ning Ke finally spoke. He looked at the sacred sedan and said calmly, "Before every battle, I am never sure that I can defeat my opponent, even if my opponent is a baby who can't cultivate. Only people like Yi Hongyu and I can understand this mentality. So you will never defeat people like us." Hunmu Liren remained silent for a while and said, "Is this, a man who lives to fight?" Ning Ke was about 1,000 feet away from the sacred sedan. He loosened his grip on the hilt and then tightened it. Hunmu Liren raised his head and stared at his face. His eyes were shining and he said, "So, do people like you know why you fight?" Ning Ke raised his eyebrows and did not answer. It was meaningless. Hunmu Liren stood up slowly. The gauze around the sacred sedan moved without the wind and revealed his body. He was wearing indigo robe and had a peaceful and powerful aura. A distant voice reverberated through the entire Yangzhou city, and it was proud and certain. "I am the son of Haotian. I love this world deeply. I fight for this world and for Haotian. Therefore I will win the eternal victory." Hearing this, Ning Ke suddenly let go of the hilt and rolled up the sleeves of his black academy uniform. He said, "Even though I don't like such a coincidence, I have to admit that I have been fighting for her." Then he came to the front of the sacred sedan. Tens of thousands of layers of gauze were blown up by the wind and then torn into pieces. The pieces had barely started to dance when Ning Ke broke through the sedan and stood in front of Hunmu Liren. Until then, the flagstones on the long street were broken into pieces. Smoke and dust were stirred up. Then the wind whistled. He exerted an unimaginable power and an unimaginable speed. He was extremely violent. Ning Ke looked at Hunmu Liren. In fact, this was the first time he met Hunmu Liren. They did not greet each other except for the time when they met by the Iron Arrow. He did not even see the face of this young Taoist Taoism before he punched at him. His punch was as heavy as Min Mountain. If it hit, even the sky would be cracked. No matter how powerful Hunmu Liren was, he could only accept his defeat. The wind from the punch hit him. Hunmu Liren's young face showed a shocked expression. He had taken Ning Ke seriously, but he did not expect Ning Ke to attack so quickly and violently. Yes, what Ning Ke wanted to do was to attack first. He wanted to use his rich fighting experience to bully this young Taoism who was in a powerful state but did not know how to fight. That was why he gave up on the saber and chose to use his fists. Only when he could control his body so perfectly could he unleash absolute speed and end all the changes before all the changes happened. Ning Ke believed that Hunmu Liren might be able to do something at the last moment. But he would not be able to stop Tianqi. Therefore, he would not be able to resist Ning Ke's fist. Ning Ke's fist was as big as an earthenware bowl. With a loud boom, the streets of the city of Yangzhou exploded. It was much more terrifying than Hunmu Liren's thunder-like words. The shredded gauze around the sacred sedan shot out like arrows. Hunmu Liren lowered his head and looked at his chest with a mocking smile. His body was covered by a thin layer of clear light. He opened his hands and aimed at the sky. Ning Ke's fist did not manage to defeat him. It did not even manage to touch his body. The thin layer of clear light slightly caved in, like an indestructible armor, blocking the infinite power outside. Two pure flames of Haotian's divine flame were burning in his palms. A majestic force came from the sky and poured into his body. This was the heavenly enlightenment. Ning Ke did not expect that his continuous silence as a foreshadowing, the hilt as a precondition, the momentum of his attack, and the final burst of power could be blocked by Hunmu Liren with absolute speed and strength. Because he did not expect that Hunmu Liren could achieve Tianqi in such a short time. He had fought with the powerful cultivators in the Tianqi state and heard from Sang Sang about Wei Guangming's Tianqi before his death. Now he realized that Hunmu Liren's speed had surpassed Wei Guangming and Xiong Chimo, and was almost as fast as the Abbey Dean in Chang'an. What state was he in? Hunmu Liren raised his head and looked at him with a faint smile, as if he was looking at a clown or a dead man. The 5 states were a very high threshold for Taoism. Inside and outside the threshold were 2 different worlds. Tianqi was the highest state above the 5 states, but Ning Ke was still below it. Hunmu was already in Tianqi. How could he defeat him? Or, you can try that talisman. Hunmu Liren looked at him and said so with a faint smile. Ning Ke had written the unimaginable talisman in Chang'an, but he could not do it in Yangzhou. Because those who were loyal to the old Tang and those who were willing to fight with him had all been killed and hung on the bridges and trees. Ning Ke had prepared a lot for today's battle. So had Hunmu Liren. At this moment, there was a faint cry of cicadas at the end of the long street. Hunmu Liren was a bit shocked. Ning Ke remained calm. He knew that his senior sister did not come. That was the real cicadas welcoming the Empress. Only he, himself, could defeat Hunmu Liren. Back then, he wrote the talisman with the help of the entire Chang'an and defeated the Abbey Dean. Later, on the Peach Mountain during the Right to Light, he defeated Xiong Chimo with the help of Sang Sang. Now he had left Chang'an. Whether Sang Sang was in the Divine Kingdom or hiding somewhere in the human world, she was not with him. So how could he defeat Hunmu, who was a Tianqi cultivator? In fact, only a moment had passed. Ning Ke's fist was still on Hunmu Liren's chest. He suddenly loosened his fist and opened his palm just like Hunmu Liren did. They were not on the Peach Mountain, so Haotian's power did not flow into his body. A drop of crystal-clear liquid appeared in his palm. The liquid was clear and sticky. It melted in the wind and turned into a bit of qi. A bit of Great Spirit. The Great Spirit started burning fiercely in his palm, emitting endless light and heat. It looked no different from the Haotian's divine flame burning in Hunmu Liren's palm. It looked a bit weird. Suddenly, Ning Ke slapped on Hunmu Liren's chest with a backhand. Different from before, the thin and clear light that covered Hunmu Liren's body seemed to think that the Great Spirit was the same holy light and did not stop it. The burning Great Spirit poured into Hunmu's body. How could he defeat a Tianqi cultivator? Master Yen Sei's method was to cut the space so that Haotian's power could not completely fall into the cultivator's body. Yulian's method was to cut the world and take the cultivator into her own world to cut off the connection between the cultivator and Haotian. Ning Kai could not do that, so he had to think of other ways. Back when he was in seclusion in the cliff cave and inherited the youngest uncle's mantle, he had been thinking about one thing. Since the Great Spirit was so similar to Haotian's divine flame, if he did not consider the difference between religion and divinity, would the two energies be the same? Tianqi accepted the power of Haotian's divine flame, so there must be a limit on the cultivator's capacity. If someone poured more power into the cultivator, would the cultivator be overwhelmed? That was his method. Hunmu Liren was in Tianqi. His body was filled with Haotian's divine flame. He could not stop the process, but he could pour a spoonful of oil on the fire and rain on the river that had overflowed the dam. He believed that the divine flame that he poured into Hunmu Liren's body was more than enough to cause a qualitative change. A little bit of the Great Spirit. That was the cultivation that he had been cultivating day and night for years. It seemed to be a little bit, but it was actually almost infinite. After a light pat, Ning Kai's face turned extremely pale. Even his cheeks looked thinner. It was not hard to imagine how much power he had lost at that moment. Hunmu Liren's face turned pale too. But it was not pale because he was weak. Instead, it was pure and holy, like jade. In contrast, his pupils had occupied his entire eye sockets. They were pure and dark, extremely sacred, but with a hint of pain. The process only lasted for a short while. Dust and smoke rose up on the long street. The qi of heaven and earth above the city of Yangzhou and even further away were disturbed. Clouds were stirred up and the sacred sedan could not hold on any longer and turned into ashes. It was as if a horrible hurricane from the storm sea in the east of the kingdom of Song had suddenly arrived here. The world turned dark and the whistling sound was like the wailing of ghosts. The houses nearby were all turned into ruins. The dust and smoke gradually dispersed. Hunmu Liren stood still. His divine robe was torn and hot air was coming out from the cracks. His mouth and nose were extremely dry. He seemed to be about to fall, but he did not. Stupid human. He looked at Ning Kai and said coldly and disdainfully, "Is this how you came up with to kill me? The divine flame is the power and will of Haotian. It is incalculable and as vast as the ocean. Where can you create another ocean? Infinite is still infinite. How can it overflow the dam?" With that, he punched at Ning Quebec. His fist was burning with Haotian's divine flame. It left a bright and blinding flame in the dark street. There was a loud bang. Ning Kai was blown backward. Half of the houses on the street were destroyed. It was quiet. No sound could be heard. Hunmu Liren withdrew his fist and looked at the divine flame on it. He was satisfied with his power. However, at the other end of the street, there was a small sound. Someone was pushing the wooden beams and stones away. Hunmu Liren squinted his eyes and looked at that direction. He was surprised and confused. Ning Kai stood up in the ruins. He was covered with blood and many bones were broken. There was a horrible wound on his chest that was punched by Hunmu. His heart could even be vaguely seen. An ordinary person would have died from such a serious injury. No matter how strong his will was, he could not stand still. However, he stood very steadily, and the expression on his face did not change. It seems that the methods in the stories are not working. He wiped off the blood on his face and looked at Hunmu Liren, "Then I have to try my new method. It might not work, but it might work." The story that Ning Kai read was called Qin Yu Year. The method was the one that the Qing Emperor used to deal with Ku He. The new method he learned was the one that he learned a few days ago. I don't want to use the name Yangzhou anymore because it is not beautiful. So I decided to use the Great Spirit. Tomorrow it will be called Fireworks in March, and the day after that it will be called 1,000 Miles Happy Wind. Chapter 1105. Hunmu Liren's fist carried the power of Haotian and landed on Ning Kei's body. But he could not kill Ning Kei, which was unbelievable to him. Ning Kei was covered in blood and wounds. Even his heart was broken. But he was still standing. How could that be? The big black horse ran to Ning Kei and lowered its head to his right hand so that Ning Kei could put his hand on his neck to help him stand. Ning Kei gently stroked its mane to show that he was fine. I forgot the order of Lian Sheng's words. Is it Buddhism to cultivate the devil, or is it Buddhism to cultivate the devil? But it's the same. Only the Vajra body can remain unstained. Ning Kei wiped the blood on his hand on the front of his academy uniform and looked at Hunmu Liren across the street. He said, "You know me well, but you don't seem to know what I spent the longest time cultivating." In the world of cultivation, he first learned Talisman Taoism, then the Great Spirit, then Lian Sheng's Devil's Doctrine, and finally he learned Buddhism from the statue of Venerable in the Lank Temple. But in fact, he had been practicing Buddhism for the longest time. The time here was not in the real world, but in the Buddhist chessboard. There, he had been practicing Buddhism for 1,000 years. In the end, he had turned the mountain-like Buddha statue into Sangsang's appearance. And during that process, he had been with Sangsang. Sangsang had always been in his body and heart. His body and mind already possessed some kind of divinity. From this point of view, while he was cultivating Buddhism, he was also cultivating the devil. He had reached the extreme. What had happened in the world of the chessboard 1,000 years ago was the last memory he wanted to recall. Except for the eldest brother who vaguely knew a little about it, he had never told anyone about the details. Taoism regarded him as a great enemy and had collected a lot of information, but they did not know that the current him, in addition to those world-shaking means, also had the Dharma. Hunmu Liren did not know either, so he could not understand Ning Kei's words. But he felt uneasy subconsciously. His dark eyes were filled with vigilance. For a powerful cultivator like him, his mind could move the heaven and earth. The hurricane rose again in the city of Yangzhou. The clouds in the sky twisted and the aura of heaven and earth became chaotic. Hunmu Liren took advantage of the wind and came to the front of Ning Kei in an instant. His right fist that was burning with divine fire turned into a bright flowing fire and punched at Ning Kei's face like a meteorite. Late spring was also the beginning of summer. Apart from the corpses hanging on the trees between the bridges, the scenery inside and outside of Yangzhou city was excellent. The weeds were green and the wildflowers were in full bloom. The mist dyed the city into a magnificent fireworks scene. Previously, when the big black horse was galloping in the wilderness and under the shade of the trees in the city, an inconspicuous little yellow flower had fallen on its mane. Now it was shivering in the wind. Ning Kei's right hand was stroking its mane and the little yellow flower. He picked it up casually. He picked up the little yellow flower with his fingers and faced the hurricane that filled the street, as well as the fiery fist. In the strong wind, the petals of the little yellow flower fell backwards, but it refused to leave the weak stem. An extremely compassionate aura was released from the petal. Hunmu Liren's fist slowed down and could not land on Ning Quebec. Ning Kei did not turn into a Buddha. He summoned the external Dharma idol. A faintly discernible Buddha appeared behind him. The Buddha did not have a broad forehead and big ears, but looked like a plump girl. It was not the Buddha or the Wisdom King, but Sangsang. It was the Buddha that he had cultivated for 1,000 years. Hunmu Liren said he was fighting for Haotian. Ning Kei said he was the same. And he had fought for her for countless years. Even now, he could let her fight for him. The burning Haotian's divine flame was still circling around Hunmu Liren's fist. It was bright and his face was extremely pale under the light. His eyes were filled with anxiety, anger, and unwillingness. Tianqi was a gift from Haotian. How could he hurt Haotian with the power that Haotian gave him? That would be blasphemy. So what? Without the power of faith, how could you invite the real Haotian? Hunmu Liren shouted furiously. His voice was like thunder in spring, exploding inside and outside the city of Yangzhou. He raised his state to its peak and continued to attack the little flower in Ning Kei's hand. His body suddenly became extremely tall and big. His hair was disheveled and his body was emitting white-hot mist. He looked like a god from the ancient times. If not for the anger in his solemn expression, he would look more like one. She is not Haotian. She is just the Buddha in your heart. The most hypocritical Buddha. The most hypocritical Buddha. The chief monk would not kill anyone even with a monk's staff. He would be chopped into a dog by Jun Mo. Even if you become a Buddha, what can you do to me? Hunmu Liren, who looked like a god, looked down at Ning Kei with a violent expression. Ning Kei's body kept bleeding. The Buddha incarnation of Sang Sang stood behind him silently and looked at the street with pity. No one knew whether it was looking at Hengmu or Ning Quebec. Hengmu was right. Without the power of faith, no matter how profound Ning Kei's dharma was, he could not invite the real Sang Sang. He could only protect himself but not hurt Hengmu. Yangzhou city was not Chang'an. Everyone here who was loyal to the Tang Empire and the Academy and was willing to help Ning Kei had been killed by Hengmu. Or they had been killed by Ning Kei and did not even dare to think about it. Therefore, Ning Kei could not write the talisman or gather the power of faith. The Academy doesn't like to call that power faith. The towering Buddha's light and the godlike horizontal tree were fighting fiercely on the long street. Ning Kei and the little yellow flower between his fingers seemed a little small in the middle, but his voice was still so calm. We call it faith. After saying this, he loosened his fingers, allowing the little yellow flower to be blown away by the wind from his fist and disappear without a trace. Meanwhile, the Buddha incarnation behind him was also destroyed by the wind. The light of Buddha suddenly disappeared into his body. He held the handle of the iron cutlass. Countless faintly discernible and faint powers came from everywhere in and outside the city of Yangzhou. They floated toward him and entered his body one by one. Hunmu Liren's face turned pale. He murmured in confusion, how could this be? Those powers were the power of faith that he thought Ning Kei could never obtain in the city of Yangzhou. Or in Ning Kei's own words, it was the power of faith. Even if the Buddha came back to life, how could he obtain the faith of the dead? Ning Kei waved the iron cutlass and hacked at Hunmu Liren. The Buddha could not hack people, but he could. The iron cutlass simply fell down. It was not a simple move because it carried the faith of countless dead people in Qinghe Prefecture. The wind blew violently. The Dharma and the divine light intertwined and then tore each other into pieces. Hunmu Liren shouted like thunder. He burned Haotian's divine flame at the cost of his life and tried to block the cutlass. Ning Kei knew nothing about faith when he was in Chang'an. The reason why he could write the two talismans with the array pestle was that he accepted the fearless faith of the Tangs in Chang'an. Now he had a deep understanding of faith. Without Chang'an, he did not have enough power to write the talismans. But he could use the Dharma to obtain enough power to hack thousands of times again. Hunmu Liren might be able to block his cutlass. But he could not block his thousands of cutlasses. On the long street, the dust was everywhere. The horrible sound of the air being torn could be heard, mixed with Hunmu Liren's screams of fear, despair, anger, and unwillingness. In an instant. As the Buddhism sect said. Hunmu Liren blocked Ning Kei's 3,782 cutlasses. Ning Kei hacked 13,782 cutlasses. Therefore, 10,000 cutlasses fell on Hunmu Liren's body. The dust gradually settled. Hunmu Liren, who was like a god a moment ago, was hacked into an ordinary person. He was covered in blood and lowered his head. He looked calm and composed, just like the young manservant in indigo who chopped firewood in the Revelation Institute 2 years ago. With a clang, Ning Kei sheathed his cutlass. Affected by the sound, Hunmu Liren's Taoist heart that had been cut into pieces could no longer be intact. He spat out blood and his internal organs that looked like gold and jade burst out from the wounds on his chest and abdomen. He lowered his head and looked at those horrible cutlasses with a confused expression. The next moment, the crystallized Great Spirit that Ning Ke had slapped into his body violently spurted out along the 10,000 cuts on his body. In the shrill whistling sound, a gale swept through the long street and then went far away. The gust of wind rolled up the reeds on the great swamp and startled the birds outside of Lincoln. It did not stop until it reached the West Hill Divine Kingdom and returned to the temple among the Peach Mountains. Ning Ke stood in the howling wind. He looked indifferent and tired. He did not feel happy at all. He ignored Hengmu Liren and sat down with his legs crossed to regulate his breath. The big black horse stood beside him and looked around vigilantly. Hundreds of cavalrymen of the divine halls had surrounded the long street. But they did not dare to come closer. I don't understand why. Hengmu Liren lowered his head and murmured. He sounded like he was in great pain. You're indeed very strong, and you've made ample preparations. You know that the iron arrow isn't my strongest technique. In order to destroy that technique of mine, you've even killed so many people. Ning Ke said, but you don't know that I have become a Buddhist cultivator. And you don't know that I have learned something in the wilderness, the dead and the living are all human beings. You killed those people, so you deserve to die. I see. Hengmu Liren raised his head and looked at him with a bitter smile. It seems that you have prepared a lot to kill me. Now that I think about it, I am willing to die. Ning Ke said, you think too much. With that, he stood up and jumped onto the big black horse. He looked around and saw the city of Yangzhou. There were small bridges, flowing water, fireworks, old trees and faintly crows. It was a miserable world, but there was no trace of her. Hengmu Liren looked at his back and shouted unwillingly, it is already the end. Can't you just admit that I am special? I am the son of Haotian. How can I be the same as the other useless people you killed? Ning Ke looked back at him and said, you always say that you are her son. The problem is that I never remember that she gave birth to you. How can I admit it? The big black horse stirred up the dust and headed to the south of the city of Yangzhou. Hengmu Liren looked at his back with great difficulty. He was lost and finally understood. Then he died. Fireworks in May. Ning Ke killed another person. The Tang army went to Yangzhou. As for the reason why I couldn't explode yesterday, I thought about it and didn't say it yesterday. Today, I'll report it to you. It's because a friend from another city has come to visit me. These 2 days, I've had to drive for 4 to 5 hours every day, and I also have to make arrangements for meals and whatnot. I'm exhausted. It's already very hard for me to be able to keep updating, and the quality is still acceptable. I'm very satisfied, and I hope that everyone is satisfied as well. It'll be fine tomorrow. After saying so much, I still strongly urge everyone to vote for me. Chapter 1106. The big black horse galloped out of the long street and no one dared to stop it, leaving only a trail of smoke. Dozens of miles out of the city, there was only mist and the wind from the lake. Even though they were near the great swamp, the big black horse did not slow down. Its hooves flew and continued to move forward, stepping on rocks and grass. It leaped high on the shore and landed on a South Jin Kingdom Navy warship several feet away. Countless splashing sounds could be heard. The South Jin Kingdom Navy officers on the warship did not dare to stay and jumped into the lake one after another. They did not care that the lake water was still cold in early summer. Those who could steer the ship had all left. How could such a large naval warship move forward on the lake? The sailors of the South Jin Kingdom and the people not far away all looked at the warship and the big black horse on the deck. Deep in their terrified eyes, they were watching a good show. Ning Ke turned over and dismounted from the horse. He took out several pieces of light yellow fu paper from the bag beside the saddle and casually pasted them on both sides of the warship's deck. He flicked his fingers and the fu paper gradually faded, as if it was being burned or melted by the lake wind. A not very strong but very stable talisman suddenly enveloped the entire warship. The chi of heaven and earth within a few miles of the lake was summoned. The sails were blown by the wind and the hull shook slightly. It began to move. Tens of thousands of South Jin Kingdom Navy officers saw this scene and were stunned. They had never thought that there would be someone in the world who could drive such a heavy warship by himself. The next moment, they began to speculate about how Ning Ke would control the warship's draft and direction. In short, their emotions were extremely complicated. Ning Ke did not care about the warship's draft. The great swamp lake was extremely deep. As long as they avoided the reeds and sand that could be seen with the naked eye, there would not be too much of a problem. As for the direction, it was very simple. He only needed the ship to go south. He did not care about the specific destination because the South Jin Kingdom was in the south. He had already prepared the talisman paper in Chang'an City and summoned the chi of heaven and earth to boost the ship. The battleship sailed at an extremely fast speed and the heavy sails swayed uneasily by the lake wind. Fortunately, there were no leaks. It only took them half a day to board the ship from the south of Qinghe Prefecture to the shore in the south. They passed through the entire Great Swamp and arrived at dusk. Although the South Jin Kingdom had been through many troubles, it was still the second most powerful country in the Central Plains, second only to the Tang Empire. The response from the imperial court to the military was extremely fast. They were already prepared for his arrival. Countless cavalrymen surrounded the dock called Tay County. There were also hundreds of cultivators hiding in the woods on both sides of the official road, ready to attack at the command. Ning Ke knew very well what was waiting for him, but he had no intention of hiding his tracks. He rode on the big black horse and continued to head south expressionlessly. Strangely, no one attacked him. The cavalrymen and cultivators of the South Jin Kingdom did not even have the courage to attack him because of his name and the iron bow on his shoulder. They could only watch him move forward. This fact made them feel extremely disappointed. 100 miles to the south, a stubborn and proud mountain that looked like an ancient sword could be faintly seen in the distance. It was the former holy land for cultivation, the Sword Garret of the South Jin Kingdom. Looking at the Sword Garret and thinking of the proud swordsmen who were once enemies and then companions, Ning Ke reached out his hand to stop the big black horse. After a moment of silence, he looked at the vigilant cavalrymen and cultivators of the South Jin Kingdom and said, "I will stay here for a while." When the snow fell, he jumped off the city of Chang'an and disappeared from the world. Few people knew that he had secretly sneaked into the northern military camp and secretly made a risky plan with General Su Chi and fourth brother to destroy the Golden Tribe. When he and the Academy and the Tang army finally defeated the Golden Tribe in the city of Wei, he stayed for a few days to write talismans in blood. Then he did not stop. He went to the southern border of the Tang Empire, out of the verdant canyon, killed Hengmu, and went down to the Dingqing River in the Yangzhou. He had traveled thousands of miles to kill people and had not rested or slept for 100 days. His spirit and body had long been exhausted, but he still moved forward. It seemed that something was urging him to speed up, as if he was racing with someone. Today, in the territory of the South Jin Kingdom, at a place where he could see the Sword Garret from afar, he suddenly stopped and told everyone that he would stay here for a while. This was very surprising. The cavalrymen and cultivators of the South Jin Kingdom looked at him on the black horse with complicated emotions. They looked at his pale face and his haggard appearance. They thought to themselves, is he finally tired? Mr. 13 of the Academy, who was rumored to kill for fun and was close to the devil. Did he want to stop after killing so many people? Anything that lasted for too long or happened too frequently would eventually make people sick of it. Except for Ning Ke and Sang Sang, Jing Tingshan was the only one who never got sick of each other. the temperature in the south was relatively higher. In the fields and hills on both sides of the river, the heat was unbearable. The coalition army of the Divine Hall and the army of the Great River Kingdom, who had been confronting each other for a long time, were already extremely tired. Even the corpses of their dead comrades on the battlefield could hardly arouse their passion and desire to fight. A slender and slightly curved sword was carefully wiped by a white handkerchief. The blood left by the enemy in the morning was wiped clean. The body of the sword reflected the green mountains behind it and looked very beautiful. Cat Girl quietly wiped the sword. The cute and naive little girl in the past was now married and became the calmest or cold-blooded swordsman on the battlefield. The most horrible place like the battlefield was not only annoying, but it was also easy to train or change people. Zhuo Zhihua stood behind her and looked at the camp of the coalition army of the Divine Hall a few miles away. She frowned slightly and still could not understand why the great divine priest of South Sea would let the army set up the formation with their backs to the river. Even if the man had been fishing in the South Sea all year round and was completely ignorant of military affairs, the Divine Hall had never lacked real military masters. Her eyes were dazzled by the reflection of the sword. She could not help but squint and look at Cat Girl with a touch of pity in her eyes. Cat Girl's newly married man died in a surprise attack by the powerhouses of the Divine Hall more than 10 days ago. The newly married woman became a widow. Although the little girl looked calm, everyone could see the hidden pain and anger in her. The guardian of the Great River Kingdom had changed from the master of calligrapher to the queen. The women of the Black Ink Garden with swords on their waists were always the symbol of courage and virtue in this country. In this tragic war, the disciples of the Black Ink Garden had always been fighting in the most difficult and tragic places. If it were not for them, the coalition army of the West Hill Divine Palace with more cultivators would have already succeeded in breaking through this line of defense and killed into the hinterland of the Great River Kingdom. Of course, the main reason why Zhuo Zhihua and Cat Girl could fight so confidently was that there were two big chariots standing side by side dozens of feet behind them. A royal chariot surrounded by snow-white gauze and a sacred chariot surrounded by blood-red gauze. In the royal chariot sat the queen of the Great River Kingdom, Mo Shanshan, and in the sacred chariot sat the great divine priest of judgment, Yi Hongyu. There was also a sacred chariot in the hills on the south bank of the great river. It belonged to Zhao Nanhai. The great divine priest of the West Hill Divine Palace's Revelation Hall had been empty for a long time. Many people thought that Zhao Nanhai, who was deeply trusted by the Abbey Dean, would take over this position. However, they did not expect that the war would come so fast that there was no time for the succession ceremony of the great divine priest of Revelation. Therefore, Zhao Nanhai was now only leading the coalition army with the title of Great Divine Priest of West Hill. Zhuo Zhihua did not understand why the coalition army of the Divine Hall set up camp with their backs to the river. Zhao Nanhai, the great divine priest of the South Sea, did not seem to be afraid to show his terrible military ability to the whole southern continent. In fact, this lord who was born as a fisherman was very experienced on the battlefield. Some time ago, he successfully dragged the army of the Great River Kingdom into a trap. If more than 100 cavalrymen of the Divine Hall who were loyal to Yi Hongyu had not suddenly rebelled on the battlefield, the Great River Kingdom would have been hit hard. The news of Ning Kei's 2 battles in the city of Wei and Yangzhou had not reached here yet. However, the role of a real powerhouse in the war was becoming more and more obvious. It had gradually become an indisputable fact. If the Great River Kingdom wanted to survive under the terrifying pressure of the West Hill Divine Palace coalition army, they had to find a way to kill Zhao Nanhai, or at least threaten him so that he would not be able to focus on the battlefield. Thinking of this, Zhuo Zhihua turned around to look at the 2 large chariots. The queen could not enter the battlefield lightly, but what about the powerhouse in the sacred chariot? The sacred chariot beside the king's chariot was as bloody as it used to be. Even if the great divine priest of judgment left the Peach Mountain, she would still be the great divine priest of judgment. Even the hierarch lord could not deprive her of her position. Naturally, her temperament would never change. According to her usual style, she would have long thought of killing Zhao Nanhai. Why was she still sitting in the sacred chariot after so many days? The great divine priest of judgment has not moved. It seems that she has guessed something. In the hills beside the great river, Zhao Nanhai stood in front of the sacred chariot that was heavily protected by thousands of papal cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace. He looked at the two large chariots in the Great River Kingdom's camp and frowned slightly. If she has guessed it, then Ning Ke might have guessed it too. After all, they are very similar. The situation in the Great River was dangerous. Actually, his situation had been very dangerous from the beginning. With Yi Hongyu's crazy fighting ability and the Queen of the Great River Kingdom who was proficient in talisman Taoism, there was an 80% chance that he would lose his life in this angry Yellow River if the enemy really risked their lives to attack. That was why he ordered the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army to line up with their backs to the river. It seemed that he was risking his life and inviting Yi Hongyu and Mo Shanshan to kill him because of his judgment of the situation. But in fact, that was not the case. The great divine priest of the South Sea who shouldered the responsibility of the divine halls in the south was as thin and dark as before. He was silent, like the surging Yellow River below the hills behind him. There was no need for words. He rarely talked to himself. At this time, he was not talking to himself, but to someone else. Ning Ke did not continue to the south. It seems that he has guessed something. A dull voice came from the sacred chariot. The river wind blew the gauze curtain, and a curtain of light could be vaguely seen. There was a figure behind the curtain. It was the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace, Xiong Chumo. Typing is easy, but writing is hard. Write and update. I won't make any changes today. I won't ask for monthly votes if I write more. I'll make up for it. Write as much as you can. I'll try to get a comment that I've turned over a new leaf, or a compliment for being handsome. Thank you. Chapter 1107. There was a middle-aged Taoist beside the carriage. He wore an ordinary Taoist robe and had an ordinary appearance. His expression was also ordinary, and there was nothing special about him. Naturally, no one knew his true identity. There were hundreds of red-robed priests from Peach Mountain in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army. The most powerful force of Haotian Taoism was gathered here, not in the divine halls of Peach Mountain. Such a terrifying force was not only waiting for Yi Hongyu and Mo Shanshan, but also Ning Ke. When the news of the Golden Tent's destruction and the death of Ada and the National Master reached Peach Mountain, Haotian Taoism began to prepare. A few days ago, the news of Ning Ke killing Hengmu in the Qinghe River had also reached here. This fact made the most powerful people of the West Hill Divine Palace silent for a long time. According to Ning Ke's speed of killing people, he should be arriving soon. The hierarch, Zhao Nanhai and the middle-aged priest began to prepare for the final battle. Even if Yi Hongyu and Mo Shanshan had some kind of tacit understanding with Ning Ke, the West Hill Divine Palace thought they could finish the battle in one go, because they had been preparing for a long time. To their surprise, Yi Hongyu did not attack, nor did Ning Quebec. If Yi Hongyu chose to wait and see because of her sensitivity to battle, then what about Ning Ke? Where did he go? Ning Ke did not go anywhere. Just like what he told the people of South Jin when he looked at the sword garret, he stayed in South Jin for a long time. He did not stay for sightseeing. He killed many people along the way. He would spare those who surrendered. He would kill those who did not. He did not surrender to the Tang, but to the people of the sword garret. These were the three sentences that Ning Ke told the people of South Jin. When the West Hill Divine Palace was ready to welcome him to the south, he stayed in the second most powerful country in the world and began to proclaim and show his cruelty. He had killed people in Panshan Commandery, in Lingang City, in the alleys and in the Imperial Palace. He had killed the new emperor of the Divine Halls of West Hill, the Prime Minister and many others. Time passed slowly but unstoppably as the people waited silently by the river and the cold-blooded killing of the South Jin Kingdom. It was midsummer in the world. Ning Ke disappeared again in the cruel weather. What he left behind were those words, his body full of blood, and the chaotic South Jin Kingdom. The southern battlefront army and the Yulin royal guards of the Tang Empire had already recovered Qinghe. After purging the old warlords, they would continue their journey south after a short rest. How could the South Jin Kingdom resist them? He had really relied on his own strength to determine the direction of the kingdom war. Why? Because he could kill people, and he was good at it. In the past, the only person in the academy who could kill people like this was Kuharan. However, it had been a long time and he was gradually forgotten by the world. What he was doing now was to make people remember him again. He entered the city of Wei and the Golden Tribe perished. He crossed the Great Swamp and the South Jin Kingdom perished. Now he disappeared again. No one knew which country in the human world he had gone to and which country was about to perish. The midsummer had passed, but the heat was still hot. The trap that the West Hill Divine Palace had prepared for Ning Ke by the Great River had never appeared, nor had they expected that he would suddenly appear near the West Hill Divine Palace. The West Hill Divine Palace referred to Taoism, while the West Hill Divine Palace referred to the location, which was the solemn Taoist temple on the top of Peach Mountain. From the small town, one could see the sacred place. The big black horse came to the West Hill Divine Kingdom and walked silently in the small town in front of Peach Mountain. Compared to the sacred Taoist temple on the top of the mountain, the town was quiet and secular, which was a sharp contrast. Ning Ke was going to buy some roasted sweet potatoes to eat, but he changed his mind when he entered the town. He thought for a while and got off the horse. He held the reins and walked to a shabby shop in the east of the town. Getting off the horse was a sign of respect. There was no one in the West Hill Divine Palace who deserved his respect, but the person in the shop was. Even though he did not know the person's character, he knew that he deserved it just because he was old. It was a butcher's shop, the only butcher's shop in the small town. Just like the small town at the border between the Kingdom of Song and the Kingdom of Yen, there was only one butcher's shop wherever the person was. The late summer was still unbearably hot. The town seemed to be in a steamer. The big black horse, who had continuously taken elixirs and eaten all the delicacies of the wilderness with Gaga, could not stand it even though its physique had been modified to be extremely special. It panted heavily. Even Ning Ke untied the collar of the front courtyard. The butcher's shop was even more stuffy. The air was filled with the smell of blood and boiling water. The air was suffocating and unbearably hot. The strong middle-aged man, however, was still wearing a leather apron. He stood in front of the thick chopping board and swung his heavy knife. Not a single drop of sweat could be seen on his bronze-colored body. The blade fell, and what splashed out were snowflakes formed by blood and fat. Ning Ke stood outside the door of the butcher's shop and looked at the butcher behind the chopping board. He said, "Hello." The butcher did not look up at him and continued chopping the meat. He said, "Just as so." Ning Ke was silent for a while and asked, "Have you seen her?" The butcher stopped chopping the meat, took a piece of cloth from the rope, and wiped his face and hands. Ning Ke continued, "I've been beating her for a long time, but I haven't found her." The butcher threw the wet cloth on the butcher's knife and looked at him. He said, "You're not as fast as the three of them, so of course you're not as fast as them." There were two words in that sentence. The first word referred to speed, and the second was the time it would take to find her. Ning Ke thought for a while and nodded politely. He said, "Thank you. I'm leaving now." The butcher reached out and held the handle of the knife through the wet cloth, so that his hand would not slip. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to continue looking for her." "Do I need to kill to find her?" "I thought even if I couldn't find her, I could at least force the Abbey Dean to come back." "You've killed tens of thousands of people, and the Abbey Dean hasn't shown up. Why do you still need to kill? Ning Ke raised his eyebrows and looked at the butcher. He said, I thought people like you and the drunkard who have experienced the everlasting night wouldn't care about what we're doing now. Am I right? The everlasting night was the most tragic story in the world, and there were countless tragic scenes. The butcher had experienced it, seen it, suffered it, and feared it. Naturally, he wouldn't care about what Ning Ke and Taoism had done. He said, I just have something that I've been wanting to ask the Academy. Ning Ke turned around and looked at him for a long time. He said, have you ever asked before? The butcher said, I can't beat the headmaster in Kuharan. The hidden meaning in this sentence was clear. His question was definitely not a good one. He couldn't beat them before, so he didn't have an answer. Now the next generation of the Academy was no match for him, so he wanted the answer he wanted. Ning Ke's expression became calmer and even a little proud. He said, go ahead. From these few words, he was no longer representing himself, the ordinary man who was looking for his wife, but the representative of the Academy. So he had to be calmer and more confident. The butcher raised the meat knife on the chopping board and placed it in front of him. With this movement, Ning Ke felt that the threshold of the butcher's shop seemed to rise along with the ground. The seemingly ordinary, thick and greasy butcher's knife seemed to be as heavy as a mountain. The headmaster always said that he was benevolent, and the Academy always said that they were for the human world. Even though Kuharan had killed so many people, he still thought that he was never wrong. Even if he killed people, he killed for the human world. Just like what the Academy and you are doing now, is it also for the human world to kill half of the people in the human world? The butcher looked at him and said, save the human world. The drunkard and I don't have such a grand wish, but how can your headmaster judge us based on this wish? Why is the Academy doing the right thing? Only by saving the human world according to your way can it be saved. Why do you have to save the human world? Ning Ke looked at him quietly and said, there is a saying that ask the common people instead of ghosts and gods. Perhaps only time can prove who is right. But at least what we see and hear with our eyes and what the Tang Empire has proven for 1,000 years, what the headmaster has done is at least relatively correct. That's because he has the biggest fists. The butcher said expressionlessly, fists are more reasonable than shit. Is the Academy such a place? Ning Ke thought of youngest uncle, third sister, and himself. He kept silent for a long time, and then he thought of his headmaster, eldest brother, and second brother. He sorted out the things that he had thought through a long time ago. You are not talking about the Academy, nor the Tang Empire. He looked at the butcher and said, the Academy is a land of gentlemen, and the Tang Empire is a country of gentlemen. But I am not. A gentleman can be deceived, but I don't want to be a gentleman. I would rather suffer eternal damnation and try to fulfill my headmaster's wish. The butcher said, what good does it do for you to let your soul walk in the underworld? Ning Ke looked at him and said very seriously, freedom. Although this word is very easy to make people feel greasy, like the knife in your hand, without freedom, it is really boring. The butcher said, even if it is unknown and dangerous. Ning Ke said, you should have vaguely guessed where I came from, so you should know that what I said is correct. I have seen it, and it should be like that. The butcher was silent for a long time, and then said, that is the underworld. If you insist that the real world is the underworld. Ning Ke said. The butcher looked at him and said, in the past, Haotian Taoism said that you are the son of Yama. It is actually wrong, but it is also right, because you will bring the world into the underworld. Ning Ke was silent for a long time. He thought of the changes of his identity over the years, the stories of the past, and the escape. He felt a little ridiculous and sad. He said, it seems, it is indeed so. The butcher said, the human world. Why should we enter the underworld? Ning Ke said, why not? The butcher said, it is very cold there. Ning Ke said, but it is also very big. After saying this, the inside and outside of the butcher shop became quiet. Because it was too quiet, there was a dead silence. The dead pig in the shop stared at the two with its round eyes, and the sheep's head in a pot of boiling water also squinted at them. They had their own ideas, and there was no consensus, so they wanted to die. In order to save my breath, there is no time to revise it, and I can't look back. The writing will definitely be rough, and I will find time to revise it. Chapter 1108. Ning Ke looked at him quietly, without the slightest fear. After a long time, the butcher put the knife back on the chopping board, but his hand did not leave the handle. He said, "I don't care about you killing people, but I care about eternity. You and anyone else from the academy should never enter the West Hill again, or I will kill you too." Ning Ke said, "I'm already here. How can you kill me?" The butcher did not answer. He just tightened his grip on the knife. The saber in his hand was the answer. The saber was as heavy as a mountain and as sharp as the wind. From the beginning of human history to the end, it had been the most terrifying saber. Just like the cyan steel sword that Kuharan once held upside down. Ning Ke's expression became serious. His right hand did not reach behind his back to hold the handle of the iron knife. His iron knife was strong, but it was not as strong as the butcher's. "I can't beat you, but you can't catch up with me either." After saying this, Ning Ke turned around and left the butcher's shop with the big black horse. The butcher stood behind the chopping board and looked at his back quietly. His eyes were as sharp as knives. The closer Ning Ke got to the Peach Mountain, the sharper his eyes became. The farther Ning Ke got from the Peach Mountain, the calmer his eyes became, like an old knife slowly being sheathed. Under the gaze of the butcher, Ning Ke walked out of the small town. He looked back and saw several divine halls under the blue sky and white clouds. The butcher's shop was the same as before in the small town of Wuxia. He could not help but think for a long time. He was no match for the butcher, and he did not know if anyone from the academy could beat him. The butcher was guarding the Peach Mountain, so the Tang cavalry could not enter the mountain. Neither could the people from the academy. Ning Ke came here today to see if there was a peaceful solution. Unfortunately, the butcher had made his stance clear. The academy had to think of another way. There was only one person who could change all of this. The South Jin Kingdom was surrounding the West Hill Divine Kingdom. Further south was the Great River. There were many small countries in the east. The Song Kingdom was the Song Kingdom, and the Qi Kingdom was the Qi Kingdom. All the countries were preparing for war. At the end of summer, Ning Ke left the West Hill Divine Kingdom. He did not go to the Great River, but to the east. Divine priests from the Song, Qi, Liang, and Qin kingdoms were dying one after another. The morale of the allied forces was greatly reduced. Just when the West Hill Divine Palace finally reacted and sent a large number of powerhouses to kill or at least temporarily trap Ning Ke, no one expected that he had already quietly come to the Tile Mountain. The small town in front of the Wa Mountain was still the same as before. The people still relied on stone carvings to make a living. The Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival was long gone, and the incense in the Lank Temple was not as popular as it used to be. Fortunately, after the collapse of the Buddha statue, the countless beautiful stones that fell were enough to carve for hundreds of years. In the early morning, it rained around the Tile Mountain. The sea breeze made the mountaintop cooler than the inland. Even though it was still summer, it felt like autumn. Just like back then. Ning Ke stood in front of the broken body of the Buddha statue, looking at the mountain path between the green mountains, the looming palace behind the forest, and the huge rocks all over the mountains and valleys. He said, "It seems that the statue imitates the Buddha, but it is not real after all." Monk Guanhai stood beside him. He put his palms together and chanted the name of Buddha. He sighed and said, "Then what is real?" Ning Ke turned to look at him and said, "The South Jin Kingdom is about to fall. Don't worry about the Yen kingdom for now. The divine hall can't even defeat the great river. Do you think Haotian Taoism can make a comeback? Victory is the only thing that matters. Monk Guanhai was silent for a moment and said, "Don't you think it's strange?" Ning Ke did not directly answer the question. The slightly cold rain fell on his face and washed away all his expressions. He said, "When we go to the West Hill, we will go to the Lank Temple too. Let's think of it as sharing the spoils." Monk Guanhai said, "The academy is destroying Buddhism. We are the disciples of Buddhism." Ning Ke said, "Wrong. Second brother is destroying the Buddhist kingdom, not Buddhism." Monk Guanhai said, "Buddha is merciful. Too many people have died, and you have killed too many." Ning Ke turned to look at him and said, "Wrong again. Your Buddha has never been merciful. He saved all living beings and taught them to learn Buddhism. In the end, he only cultivated a smaller nirvana. All he wanted was to get through the everlasting night and pursue more than eternity. Has Buddha ever really cared about the human world?" Monk Guanhai said, "According to what you said, what have we been cultivating for decades?" Ning Ke said, "The Buddhist scriptures are not all written by Buddha. Master Chishan taught me to read them. You have also read them. Cultivating Buddhism is not cultivating Buddha, but ourselves." Monk Guanhai was silent. Ning Ke continued, "You are the Buddha, and so am I. Everyone in the world can become a Buddha. Just like what Yi Su said in the scripture of the new stream, everyone is Haotian. So the human world is naturally a Buddha kingdom and a divine kingdom." Monk Guanhai sighed with emotion. He looked at his pale and thin face and said, "What about you? Continue killing like this? You can't hold on for long." There were some wild flowers in the ruins of the Buddha statue. They were yellow, very similar to the one he saw years ago. Ning Ke looked at the flower and the mountain path hidden in the forest. He thought of what Sang Sang said in the temple. He slightly squinted his eyes, but it was hard to tell whether he was happy or sad. He had traveled thousands of miles in the human world and killed people at the expense of his state and lifespan. Just like the butcher said, he was not as fast as the Abbey Dean and the drunkard. But he believed that he knew her feelings and her most cherished past in the human world. Even if he could not sense her specific location, it was still possible to find her. For example, she might be living in the temple on the Tile Mountain, right? Unfortunately, she was not there. He said, "I'll hold on for as long as I can." Monk Guanhai said, "Prove Tao by killing." Ning Ke shook his head and said, "That's too pretentious and perverted. Only someone like Lien Sheng would do something like that. Although the number of people I've killed and will kill is no less than Lien Sheng and I'm no less evil than him, my way of thinking is different. I don't know what will happen to the human world, and I don't have any intention of destroying the world." Monk Guanhai sighed and said, "It seems that you also think something is wrong." This was the second time he mentioned it. The victory of the Tang Empire and the academy seemed to be built by Ning Ke's killing. But in fact, it was the general trend. He just used this horrible way to speed up the whole process. Taoism had ruled the world for countless years, and the West Hill Divine Palace had unimaginable resources. Logically speaking, they should not be defeated so quickly. The reason was Yi Su's death. Because of Yi Su's death, the new stream grew like weeds after the spring rain. It seriously shook the rule of Taoism. Because of Yi Su's death, the West Hill Divine Palace was divided and had endless internal strife. Everything seemed to be because of the Abbey Dean's irrational decision. But would the Abbey Dean make an irrational decision? Even the most irrational person would not think so. Monk Guanhai would not think so, and neither would Ning Quebec. He had even vaguely guessed the truth. But he had no choice but to be a pawn. Guessing the Abbey Dean's thoughts did not mean that he could see through his plan. Ning Ke could only use the simplest solution to solve the complicated situation. The simplest solution was life and death. The distance between the sword and the knife was like two different worlds. He only hoped that he could be fast enough to change the human world before the Abbey Dean succeeded. Then, even if the Abbey Dean's plan succeeded, it would be meaningless. There were many people who wanted to change the human world. The headmaster, the Buddha, Kuharan, and Lotus had all tried. Some failed, and some were still on the way. People like the drunkard and the butcher did not want to change the human world, which was also a kind of influence or change. But the premise was that these people were powerful. Some people might not be as unfathomable as the butcher in terms of state or strength, but they could still change the world, because they had unfathomable and strong willpower. Deep in the West Wilderness, the dark underground world which had been surrounded by the prison wall for tens of thousands of years had been completely changed by one person. The wildfire lit up the world and the Prajna Peak, and also pointed out the way. The uprising war over the past few years had completely changed the order of the underground Buddha kingdom. Especially in early summer, the reinforcements of the Right King's palace were sneakily attacked by a Tang army that came out of the Pamir Mountains. Their supplies and fodder suffered heavy losses. Since then, no one could change the outcome of the war. Between the giant peaks that grew from the bottom of the giant sinkhole, there were flames everywhere. Many of the yellow temples hidden in the green forest had been swallowed by the flames. In the continuous forest, there were also many burned scars. The Taoist trees were gone, and countless mountain paths were exposed, like countless threads trying in vain to stitch something together. At the front of the mountain road, Jun Mo held the iron sword and looked at the seriously injured Qin Yen without any expression on his face. The clothes he used to wear were destroyed in the battle, and he picked up a monk's robe from somewhere. His new hair was still gray, so he did not keep it. It was very short and reflected the fire in the distance, making him look like a Buddha. Under a Bodhi tree not far away, Master Huang Yang had already closed his eyes and left. As a Tang, he did not know how to deal with the academy and the Buddha kingdom. He did not know if he had found the answer after years of hard thinking. But no one was qualified to say that it was escape, or more accurately, relief. Qin Yen was covered in blood, and his kasaya was broken. He looked extremely haggard. He pointed at the wildfire on the mountain and the temples that were gradually turning into ashes, and said, "Killing people and destroying Buddha is the principle of the academy." Jun Mo said, "Destroying Buddha is my principle." Qin Yen said, "I have heard of a saying in the academy, existence is the principle." Jun Mo said, "Youngest brother's words are extremely wrong." Qin Yen said bitterly, "It is really impossible to reason with Mr. Second." Jun Mo's expression did not change, and he said, "Because I am reasonable. You can't reason with me." I went out for a walk after dinner, and then continued writing. Chapter 1109. Qin Yen looked at him and said with a complicated expression, "What is the hatred between the Buddha and the academy? From you to Ningke, it seems that you all want to destroy the academy. No matter what happens, you will not stop." Jun Mo said, "The academy does not enforce justice for heaven or ask questions for the human world. We only do what we want to do. We have our own reasons. You are of no benefit to the world. Why do you exist?" Qin Yen pointed to somewhere on the cliff platform and said, "The pear blossoms in the unknown mountains are beautiful, but no one can see them. They are of no benefit to the human world. Why do you exist?" Jun Mo shook his head and said, "The pear tree needs the nutrients in the soil and greedily takes the sunlight. The weeds under the tree must think differently from you. The Buddhism sect does not produce and only wants the human world to worship them. They are no different from Taoism. They are locusts and you are maggots. They are equally disgusting." Qin Yen disagreed and said, "The Buddha land is a paradise. Countless sages have meditated for thousands of years. They have their own spiritual fruits and thoughts. I don't ask you to respect them, but you should at least leave some seeds. The Buddha land is a paradise for monks, but a purgatory for the wicked. Only you can enjoy the fruits and jade. The metaphysical is called Tao. If you want to talk about Tao in the human world, you must let most people live like human beings. Jun Mo continued, you want to persuade me with youngest brother's words. Let me give you some of youngest brother's words. He once said, there will be steamed buns, rice wine, and everything else. As long as people are alive, everything can be reborn, such as your fruits and jade, and those Tao. Qin Yen was silent for a long time and asked, what else? Another one is that all bald donkeys should die. Senior brother, what you said makes sense. Jun Mo added, the senior brother he was referring to was me. Qin Yen couldn't help but laugh bitterly. He was defeated by the iron sword today. The monks of the commandment hall were either dead or seriously injured. The monk soldiers and the noble armed forces in the tribes could no longer resist the tide of millions of slaves. Was the Xiankong temple or the Buddhism sect really going to perish? As a world wayfarer of the Buddhism sect, Qin Yen felt very painful and unwilling to see such a scene. There were many others who felt the same way, such as the young monks who were moaning under the Bodhi tree, and the old monks who were weeping when they saw the burning temples. No one was willing to accept such an ending. The sounds of battle shook the heavens. The revolutionary army surged along the mountain path like a tide and was about to drown the entire Prajna peak. The people at the forefront could already see what was happening on the mountain path. Looking at those slaves who used to be lowly burning the temple like madmen and running around recklessly, Qin Yen felt that these people were crazy. With a determined look, he sat cross-legged on the mountain road and began to recite scriptures. He was chanting the rebirth mantra. Qi didn't know if he was to see himself off. The tranquil chanting of sutras rose from the mountain path and spread to the countless plateaus and temples in the mountains. The young monk, who was covered in blood, struggled to sit up. He supported his shaky body and sat under the tree. As Qin Yen began to chant, the old monk wiped away the tears in his wrinkles and began to chant. In the ruins of the main hall of the Xiankong temple, dozens of powerhouses from the commandment hall, who were on the verge of death, also began to chant. Suddenly, a melodious bell rang out from an unknown place, accompanying the chanting of sutras like an accompaniment. The chanting turned into the chanting of Buddha. The chanting of Buddha echoed throughout the mountain. A sense of compassion, relief, and solemnity was released from countless monks and temples, permeating between the clouds in the sky and the wilderness underground. In the deepest part of the mountain, at the bottom of the cliff cave sealed by sand and stones, the chief monk of scripture, who was chained to the wall by iron arrows, slowly opened his eyes. He heard the chanting of Buddha outside the mountain and knew that the Xiankong temple and the Buddhism sect had reached the most dangerous moment. His eyes showed reluctance and then calmness. The chief monk struggled to raise his skinny hands and put them together in front of his chest. His withered face revealed a compassionate expression. His gray lips moved slightly. Although the voice was faint, it sounded like a dragon's roar in the sky. The chanting of Buddha from the cliffs finally came to the depths of the cliff cave and merged with the weak chanting of the chief monk. The meditation of countless monks merged with his meditation. Although he was a Buddha in the human world, he could not bear so many complicated beliefs. His facial features began to ooze blood and his whole body began to emit a faint Buddha's light. Then his skin gradually faded in the Buddha's light, revealing his flesh and bones. He looked horrible. The beginning of life was just a pool of blood or pus. The Buddhism sect used this method to let believers know impermanence. They also did the same. Only in this way could they be truly pure. The chief monk closed his eyes. There was no slightest tremble in his sunken eye sockets. He seemed to be dead, or he was still alive. He was returning to the beginning of life, death. He was turning into pus and blood. Drip, drip, drip. The purest and filthiest blood dripped on the ground of the cliff cave and seeped into the depths of the mountain through a crack that was invisible to the naked eye. After a long time, it finally reached the bottom of the mountain. There was a river of hot magma underground. A chessboard was floating in the river. It was the Buddha's chessboard. When Sang boarded the giant boat, she threw it back to the mountain from thousands of miles away and suppressed it in the horribly hot magma at the bottom of the mountain. Without external help, it would never wake up. Today, the Xiankong temple was about to be destroyed. Countless monks died. Their souls floated into the chessboard to replenish their spirits. Then the chessboard finally woke up with the help of the chief monk's blood. On the mountain road, Qi Nian was covered in blood. He led thousands of monks and confronted countless uprising slaves. In the chanting of Buddha, the cliff of the mountain began to peel off. Smoke and dust were everywhere. This mountain was called Prajna Peak. It was transformed by the remains of the Buddha. The cliff plateau of the Prajna Peak was gradually destroyed. The cliff gradually became flat and blurred. That was the appearance of the Buddha. Suddenly, a white crane flew from the west. Suddenly, heavenly flowers fell from the clouds. The Buddha's light illuminated the world at the bottom of the giant sinkhole. The Buddha was dead. But he was still alive. No one could find him. Sang and the headmaster could not find him, nor could they completely erase his existence. The Buddha woke up in the chessboard and looked at the human world quietly. He looked at those human beings who dared to destroy him like ants. There was no pity, only majesty and anger. The revolutionary army looked at the top of the mountain in horror. Looking at the majestic face in the light of Buddha, their bodies trembled uncontrollably and their faces became extremely pale. That was the real Buddha. They had never understood Buddhist scriptures. But they had been devout believers since childhood until Jun Mo appeared. They began to doubt whether the Buddha existed or not. Even if he existed, it was meaningless. Today, the Buddha appeared in the human world. The awe rooted in the depths of their souls made it difficult for them to think. They subconsciously let go of the weapons in their hands and knelt down in fear in front of the Buddha transformed from the mountain. The chanting of Buddha and thousands of monks were solemn. No one dared to stand. Jun Mo stood with his head slightly lowered and his expression was indifferent. There is one more chapter. It is almost finished. I will update it soon. Chapter 11:10. Jun Mo was wearing a monk's robe. His hair was very short, and his sleeves were fluttering in the wind. He looked like a young monk. He stood on the mountain road, facing the peak in the Buddha's light, as if he was in front of Buddha. He was silent and did not raise his iron sword to fight again. He was not afraid of any enemy, even Buddha. The chessboard had been suppressed by Haotian for many years. Even if Buddha was resurrected and came back to the human world through the mountain, he would be much weaker than Buddha in his heyday. At least he had a chance to interrupt the process. Buddha might really be waiting for Taoism and the academy to suffer losses and then come back. But he didn't care. He didn't care anymore. He didn't do anything. He put his hands behind his back, and the iron sword was behind him. He was very tired. His eyebrows were very straight, like a sword, which could be used to fight. Like a ruler, which could be used to measure. He didn't want to fight anymore, because he was still lonely in the human world. On the mountain peak, everyone was kneeling. Those who had fought bitterly with him for many years had knelt the moment the Buddha ancestor revealed his true form. He stood alone and felt really lonely. He didn't want to measure, because it was really hard to measure people's hearts. There was a thin layer of frost between his eyebrows. The frost came from the bottom of his heart, and it was a little cold. In the Buddha's singing, he just stood there with his head down. All the slaves lowered their heads and touched the ground with their foreheads in fear. They didn't dare to look directly at the Buddha's light, let alone look at Buddha's face. Naturally, they couldn't see his somewhat desolate figure. They were like a group of ants bathed in the Buddha's light, not daring to move. But However, for thousands of years, it was believed that there would always be a few maverick ants in the ant colony who, for some mysterious reason, decided to temporarily look away from the rotten leaves and shells to the blue sky. Then, their world was different. Because they saw, they were afraid? No. Only when they saw, they wouldn't be afraid. A young slave, supporting his body with trembling hands, couldn't suppress his strong curiosity and concern. He raised his head in fear and looked ahead of the mountain road. He saw the Buddha's light, the lonely Junmo in the Buddha's light, and the Buddha's face. It turned out that Buddha looked like that. Looking at Junmo in the Buddha's light, he suddenly felt very ashamed and humiliated. An unknown source of courage came to his body. With a trembling hand, he reached for the hilt of his sword and grasped it again, then stood up shakily. He stood up. He looked around at his companions, wanting to say something, wanting to call on them to stand up as bravely as he did. But he found that no one was looking at him. His voice was too small in the powerful and solemn Buddhist chants. He felt a little lonely, so he understood Junmo's loneliness and pride. He wanted to say something to Junmo, but he didn't know what to say. He looked at the towering Buddha light, at the Buddha, and at the disciples of the Buddha. He wanted to debate with them, but he realized that he couldn't even understand the Buddhist scriptures they were singing. He was getting more and more irritated. He scratched his head anxiously. The more anxious he was, the more he found the Buddhist chants irritating. His chest heaved up and down, and his breathing became rapid. In the end, all of his emotions gathered together and turned into 3 words, bursting out from his lips. He looked at the Buddha in the Buddha's light and shouted, "Shut up." At this moment, the Buddhist chanting seemed to stop for a moment. Many people heard these 3 words. Junmo lowered his head. The tiredness between his eyebrows somehow faded, and the corners of his mouth were slightly raised. Qi Nian remembered the conversation he had with Yi Su in the wilderness many years ago. When the chief monk was preaching, I saw countless flying ants bathing in the light and rising. The flying ants will eventually fall, and they will never touch the sky. The ants can fly and fall, but they are better at climbing, and good at laying the foundation for their companions. They are not afraid of sacrifice. If the ants pile up one by one, as long as there are enough of them, they can definitely pile up into a pile that can touch the sky. Qi Nian was terrified, and he felt cold all over. Yi Su finally began to believe in the ants, and began to lead them to the sky. However, he had long forgotten the words he had said in the past, the principles he had believed in. He looked at the slave standing in the Buddha's light, and suddenly felt desperate. This was just the first ant, and there would be more ants standing up. Yes, the slaves kneeling in the Buddha's light looked at each other. Although they were confused, more people stood up. Some shouted to shut up, and more were silent. But they stood up. More and more slaves slowly stood up in the Buddha's light, like a black tide. The shouts were getting louder and louder, echoing between heaven and earth. "Shut up! Shut up!" Junmo lowered his head and listened. The corners of his mouth were getting higher and higher, and finally turned into a smile. At first, it was a smile, then a broad smile, and finally a hearty laugh. He laughed with great pleasure. Ha 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 ha. Finally, they stood up. Those who did not want to be slaves. Did you hear that? He looked at Qi Nian, and the smile on his face gradually disappeared. He shouted, "Shut up." His voice was like the sound of a bell, drifting between the peaks, refreshing the heart, and shocking the mind. All the peaks were silent for a moment. Qi Nian and countless monks spat out blood and fell to the ground. The Buddhist chanting stopped. The Buddha in the form of the mountain was still quietly looking at him in front of him. Junmo looked at him and shouted, "Even if you are really the Buddha, so what? I cultivate Buddhism, and I am the Buddha. All living beings in the world can become Buddhas as long as they want to. Then why do I need you as the Buddha? Under the peaks, in the sky and on the ground, there was no supremacy. There were only millions of old and weak women and children, slaves covered with scars, and women who had been humiliated. All eyes were on him. All the power followed him, and handed over to him because of trust. An unimaginable majestic power filled his body. He raised the iron sword in his hand and chopped at the Buddha. At this moment, he was like a god, but he was not a god. His sword seemed to come from the netherworld, but he was not the messenger of the netherworld, nor was he the representative of the human world. He was just a scholar in the academy. The scholar with a high crown who wanted to draw his sword when he saw injustice. A clear shadow of the sword appeared in the sky, and the clouds were cut open. The sunlight shone through the gap, diluting the Buddha's light between the peaks, but still making the world bright. The iron sword fell. The Buddha was chopped by the iron sword. Many years ago, he chopped the stone statue of the Buddha into countless stones in the Lank Temple. Many years later, he really chopped the Buddha into countless stones. The thunder-like roars kept ringing. The cliffs cracked, the mud and stones fell, the trees were uprooted, and the temples were shaking. The wails and cries of the monks could be heard everywhere. Everyone left the peaks and looked at the collapsing cliffs from dozens of miles away. They were shocked by the scene and didn't know what to say. Qi Nian and many monks didn't go down the mountain road. Suddenly, an extremely harsh sound rang between heaven and earth. It was the sound of rocks rubbing against rocks deep underground. It was the sound of the heavy mountain breaking and then sliding on the broken section. The giant peak broke from the root and slowly fell toward the east. The mountain was too high, and it was very slow at first, but it gradually accelerated in the end. When the mountain finally fell on the field, it didn't hit anyone, but the earthquake caused a lot of trouble. The sky was full of smoke and dust, as if it had entered the night ahead of time. After a long time, the smoke and dust gradually dissipated, and people could see the scene in front of them clearly. They were shocked speechless again. The giant peak was like the iron sword in Jun Mo's hand. It cut a whole dozens of miles wide in the earth, and the peak itself became the road paved on the whole. In the east where the peak was pointing, there was a huge gap in the precipitous cliff wall, facing the peak from a distance. It looked like two bridges. As long as one walked across the field full of blooming wildflowers, they would be able to connect. The slaves looked at the big gap in amazement, and some bold people began to walk over there. The people in the west climbed the bridge formed by the giant peak and also began to walk over there. After a long time, they finally reached the bottom of the cliff, and walked to the gap that had become a gentle slope. Millions of slaves walked up the slope. They walked in silence, from dusk to early morning. They now knew what the ground was, but they still looked forward to it, and then nervous, and even a little afraid. They walked in silence, with only the sound of footsteps, dense and rustling. Anyone who saw this scene and heard these footsteps would be moved. After walking for a long time, a light finally fell on the face of a boy in the front. He opened his mouth wide, his eyes slightly narrowed, and he was a little confused by the light. "Oh, Grandpa," the sun was on the ground, as high as us. Facing the light of the morning sun, the slaves who had lived underground for generations finally came to the world above the ground. Just like the child, people admired, people were silent, people cried, for those ancestors who never came to the ground and saw such a sun. It turned out that the sky was very close. It turned out that the earth had no edge. It turned out that this was the taste of freedom. Crying and dancing, from early morning to sunset, to the appearance of the stars in the sky, and the bright moon, people's carnival, never ended. Jun Mo walked under the Bodhi tree and began to rest. He looked at the traces left by Buddha's nirvana under the tree, did not say anything, looked up at the moon and said, "In this matter, teacher, you are not as good as me. This chapter is awesome. I suggest you go back to the preface. There are 2 paragraphs that are exactly the same. I'm awesome. Of course, I just copied it. Finally, I wrote this paragraph, which is one of the several chapters of the night. The last sentence is my comment, not about fighting, but about other aspects. Anyway, I'm happy today. Tomorrow, let's talk about tomorrow's things. Chapter 11:11. Compared with the dark and miserable world underground, the wilderness above ground was indeed as beautiful as the pure land of bliss at the end of summer. But how could there be a truly clean place? Although the Right King's palace was in a difficult situation after being harassed by the Tang Empire's Western Expedition Army, it still ruled the vast wilderness and the battle continued. After a few days, Junemo returned to the Bodhi tree to rest again. At this moment, Tang came from afar and looked at him quietly for a long time. He said, "You've worked hard. I admire you." This was true admiration. Junemo had proved himself to be the most powerful among the powerhouses of their generation. But it was not because of his strength that he could make an arrogant master of the devil's doctrine like Tang admire him. Junemo stood up and said, "It's not hard to do what I want to do." Perhaps it wasn't mentally tiring, but his body was covered in dust and his face was full of fatigue. Anyone could see how much damage and exhaustion the past few years of endless fighting had taken on him. Tang looked back at the restless cavalrymen of the Right King's palace in the distant wilderness and said, "Leave it to me. We desolate men have wandered in the world for thousands of years. We are experienced. Go and rest." Junemo did not thank him, nor did he rest. He used his empty sleeves to wipe off the dust on his monk robe and turned to leave. Tang stroked the legendary Bodhi tree and said, "I thought you would cut down this tree. Don't touch this Bodhi tree and the chessboard in the peak. Youngest brother needs them." After saying this, Junemo walked towards the southeast without saying goodbye. There were still many things to deal with in the Central Plains. The underground slaves came out of the giant sinkhole and saw the real and boundless world. But this world was also a bigger giant sinkhole. He wanted to bring more people to a bigger world. This was something that the headmaster of the academy, youngest uncle, and the generation of the academy had never forgotten. Shouts gradually sounded in the wilderness. The slaves who had fought side by side with him for several years looked at his back reluctantly. The news of his departure spread further and further. Millions of people around the countless bonfires did not dare to ask him to stay. They all knelt down to see him off, like waves of wheat. Summer passed and autumn came. The flow of time seemed to have slowed down a lot. Too many things had happened in this year. For the common people who had been living a difficult life and waiting helplessly for the end, it was really difficult to bear. However, for those who were racing against time, they felt that time had passed too quickly. There were still many things that they had not done in time, and time had gone to who knew where. It had been a long year for the Tang Empire. It had been a long year. The imperial court and the three armies had worked together. They had finally withstood the terrifying pressure coming from all sides of the border and started the counterattack. In the past 2 seasons, the Tang army had destroyed of the Golden Tribe and recovered the Qinghe River. They had shown their valiance and fearlessness to the world. The Tang did not have to worry about the most powerful enemy in the north of the north. They had paid a great price. The northern army and the wilderness of the army of the wilderness. Of the wilderness of the wilderness. Kingdom of wilderness. Kingdom of the wilderness of kingdom. And kingdom as of the Tang. Kingdom of Tang of war. It was not time to recuperate and return to the Xianwan plain. But the Tang Empire needed to rest. The human world ushered in a short but precious period of peace. Because everyone knew that the peace was just an illusion. The main force of the Tang army stopped at Qinghe Prefecture and did not continue to the south. They rested and reorganized their navy. However, the South Jin Kingdom had fallen into chaos because of Ning Kei's bloody assassination that did not care about the status of the powerhouses. It seemed that the once second most powerful country in the world could not stop the iron hooves of the Tang army from the south. On the two most important battlefields, Haotian Taoism had suffered a crushing defeat and had lost all initiative. Based on the current situation in the South Jin Kingdom, the West Hill Divine Palace finally realized their position. They withdrew the troops that were invading the Great River as quickly as possible and withdrew all the powerhouses back to the West Hill Divine Kingdom. In the human world, only the West Hill Divine Kingdom, the Yen Kingdom, and the corner of the East Land were still under the control of Taoism. Some of the more important places were already under the control of the Tang Empire. Even the small countries that were loyal to the divine halls of Song, Qi, Liang, and Chen were in an extremely turbulent situation. Chen Pipi led more than a dozen disciples left by Yi Su and even more followers, ignoring the danger of being chased by the experts of the divine hall. They kept preaching along the coastline, igniting the flames of apostasy one after another. The situation of Taoism was as precarious as a pile of eggs, and it seemed that it would be destroyed at any time. The reason why the flames of the new stream burned so fiercely was not only because of the shock and indescribable impact of Yi Su's sanctification on the ordinary believers, but also because of the situation in the world. Many people, including some divine priests of the divine halls of West Hill, thought that the world had been settled. The divine halls of West Hill would inevitably be replaced by the Tang Empire, and Taoism would naturally be replaced by the new stream supported by the Academy. Countless divine priests of the Taoist temples in the cities and towns fled with the gold and silver they had plundered over the years. Not to mention exterminating the new stream, the true devout believers could not even find a suitable place to pray for Haotian's mercy. But was the world's situation really settled? If the Tang Empire and the Academy could not conquer the Peach Mountain, the divine halls of West Hill would still stand on the peak and look at the human world coldly and arrogantly. With the wealth and resources they had accumulated over the years, they could still have a lot and survive for a long time. Who knew what would happen in the future? 1,000 years ago, Taoism gathered the whole world to fight against the Tang Empire. Countless powerhouses of the knowing destiny state left their seclusion deep in the mountains and went to Chang'an. The Tang Empire was in a dangerous situation at that time, and the world situation seemed to be settled. But who would have thought that the headmaster of the Academy alone could solve all the problems and establish the Tang Empire's undefeated reputation for 1,000 years? They could not declare victory until the final victory, and they could not stop fighting until the battle was over. Jun Mo believed in the latter, while Ning Ke and Yi Hongyu believed in the former. All in all, the vast human world had never been simple. Moreover, those who stood at the top of the human world knew that if they could not determine the outcome of the Haotian Divine Kingdom, the outcome of the human world could be reversed at any time. Of course, the outcome of the human world was also very important. Everyone's eyes were following the traces left by Ning Quebec. They watched him go from the wilderness to the Qinghe River and then to the Southeast Sea. They all thought that he would go north to the Yen Kingdom, because where Long Qing was, they believed that the next person he would kill would be Long Qing. The powerhouses of the Divine Hall and the Yen Kingdom's cavalry were waiting for him, but he never came. No one knew that Ning Ke was still in the Lang Temple. He cultivated in the temple, rested in front of the ruins of the Buddha statue, and learned how to smash stones from the children in the small town in front of the Hua Mountain. From last night until now, I've been thinking about it for a long time. There's an important plot at the end, but I still haven't figured it out. Or rather, I can't get past myself, so I'm still hesitating. Just by looking at the chapter name, you'll know that it's very important. Just by looking at it, you'll know that it's very important. If you can figure it out, I will continue writing at night. If not, I will continue thinking at night. Of course, to avoid waiting, I will only write these 2,000 words today. So, I have a deal with you. Chapter 11-12. When Ning Ke and Sang Sang were besieged by the cultivation world, they went to the West Wilderness through the Buddha's chessboard. The Lank Temple in the autumn rain suffered the wrath of the academy. Jun Mo's iron sword pierced through the air and cut the largest Buddha statue on the top of the tile mountain into countless pieces. The pieces rolled down from the peak and piled up in the valley, crushing half of the old temple. Fortunately, the huge rocks did not cause a disaster to the town. They had been soaked by the sea rain and wind for years and were gradually covered with moss. Instead, they had become a rare scenery. When the Yulon Hungry Ghost Festival stopped and the incense in the Lank Temple declined, it had become the only way to attract tourists. The main income of the town's residents now came from the stones that the Buddha statues had turned into. The people broke these boulders into countless small pieces, then carved them into Buddha statues and sold them to the tourists who admired them. Of course, it was very difficult to break the boulders. Even the heaviest hammer and the sharpest iron knife could not help the residents achieve their goal easily. The most common method for people was to burn them with fire and pour them with water. The fire was a wildfire ignited by the hay in the fields outside the town. The water was the seawater from the Tile Mountain. The quarry in the southeast of the town was filled with smoke from morning to night. The hot steam rose and the slightly red rocks suddenly made a sizzling sound when they encountered the cold seawater. This repeated tastelessly again and again. Eventually, there would be a clear crack on the hard rocks, and that was the key to breaking the rocks. Ning Kei stood on the hillside beside the quarry and watched the process of the residents breaking the stones. He watched in silence for a long time, watching the alternation of fire and water, and the cracks that appeared on the moss-covered boulders. He found that most of the cracks followed a certain pattern when they appeared, and two oblique cracks would meet at a certain place. The two cracks formed together and looked like a word. He naturally remembered the sword marks on the rocks at the bottom of the Daming Lake in the depths of the Tianqi Mountain many years ago. Youngest uncle had used a sword to write countless words outside the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, thus making the great blockage formation left by the great divine priest of light, the founder of the Devil's Doctrine, useless. The rock was broken into smaller pieces, which were then smashed by the adults with iron. Then, the children rushed over and picked up the stones of different sizes that they could carry. Then, they carefully selected the stones and separated them according to their size and the direction of the stone lines. Finally, they were delivered to the hands of the stonemasons. Of course, most of the stonemasons in the town became a monk halfway through their cultivation. Ning Kei, for example, only began to learn Buddhism halfway through his cultivation. However, they carved day and night and became very skilled at it. A square stone about a foot long could be turned into a beautifully carved Buddha statue in 10 days and nights. After Ning Kei finished looking at the broken rocks, he watched the stonemasons carve Buddha. After watching for 3 days, he began to learn Buddha carving from the stonemasons. It did not take long for him to become the best carver in Wa Mountain. In the last few years of the Buddha's chessboard, he had made the entire mountain look like a Buddha. How difficult could the stones be for him? However, the Buddha statue he carved was very different from the one made by the stonemasons in the town. The stonemasons praised his comprehension and skills and raised many opinions, but he only smiled and did not explain. The Buddha statue that Ning Kei carved did not have a wide forehead and big ears, let alone a compassionate one. Instead, it was a slightly plump young woman with her hair combed into a bun. It was obvious that the young woman's expression was extremely cold. One day, it was raining in the Lank Temple. Ning Kei was holding a stone outside the temple and continuing to carve. Suddenly, a lazy voice came from behind. Did she successfully lose weight? She lost some weight in Chaoyang City in the chessboard. Ning Kei placed the stone statue in a dozen stone statues beside him. He put down his carving knife, patted the dust off his body and stood up. The man said, "She lost so little weight in 1,000 years. It seems that Haotian is not omnipotent." Ning Kei smiled and turned around to hug him. He said, "Didn't you like her before? Why are you so mean now? It doesn't suit your high and mighty identity as the leader of the new stream." Chen Pipi curled his lips in boredom and said, "Do you like her high and mighty, or do you like her as before?" Ning Ke thought about it and found that the answer was indeed obvious. He smiled helplessly and looked at Tang Xiaotang who was standing beside him. He was surprised to find that she still had a ponytail and said, "Not married yet?" Tang Xiaotang was not shy and said, "Waiting for my brother to come." Chen Pipi sighed and said, "I don't expect to wait for my father's approval." Ning Ke looked at him again and looked at the loose indigo robe he was wearing. He thought of the Abbey Dean who wore indigo robes twice in Chang'an and found that he did look like the Abbey Dean after losing weight. The three of them walked to the pavilion nearby. The autumn rain fell on the eaves of the pavilion and accumulated for a long time before turning into a thin stream, flowing down the pillars and wetting the ground under the pavilion. Chen Pipi asked, "Have you finished?" Ning Ke took out a scroll from his arms and handed it to him. He said, "It would be better if Yi Su or eldest brother wrote it. You know, I am a non-believer after all." It was something he wrote when he was meditating and observing the stones in the Lang temple. If it was approved, it might become the last and most important volume of the doctrine of the new stream. Chen Pipi took the scroll and said, "Eldest brother will have a higher chance of success. It will be harder for me to do it. But don't worry, your efforts will not be wasted in my hands." Ning Ke said, "We don't have much time. We have to hurry." Chen Pipi opened the scroll and looked at the words about the new world, the divine kingdom and the afterlife. He frowned and said, "What a magnificent picture." Ning Ke said, "From the master to the uncle to our generation, the academy has spent 1,000 years to prepare. It would not be fun if we can't have a magnificent picture." Chen Pipi put away the file and looked at the weariness and haggard expression on his face. He thought about what he had done in the past 6 months. He took out a small porcelain bottle from his sleeve and handed it over, saying, "Take it when you need it." Ning Ke's expression changed slightly when he smelled the fragrance of the medicine in the porcelain bottle. He had taken this medicine before and knew how precious it was. He said, "At our current state, a heavenly power pill can only give us a chance. There is no need to waste it. I kept this medicine for senior brother Yi Su to help him break through the 5 states." Chen Pipi was silent for a moment and said, "But I didn't expect that he could no longer cultivate. Now that he is dead, what's the use of keeping it? Even if it can't help you break through the state, it can at least help you heal the hidden injuries in your body. It sounds cool to kill people from thousands of miles away, but it is extremely hard. You seem to be resting in the Lang temple these days, but you are actually exhausting your energy. Both the academy and the new stream need you to keep standing." Ning Ke thought about it and didn't say anything else. He put the porcelain bottle into his sleeve. Tang Xiaotang said, "If youngest uncle thinks that the gift is too expensive and can't repay it, you can return it." Ning Ke smiled and said, "You are not married to him yet and you are already working for him. Tell me, what do you want?" Tang Xiaotang pointed at the row of stone statues outside the pavilion and said, "Give me one." Ning Ke didn't expect this. He walked out of the pavilion and picked up a stone statue that he was most satisfied with. He handed it to her and said, "It's not like I haven't seen the real person. Why do you need to look at this cold statue?" Tang Xiaotang took the stone statue and wiped the rain off with her sleeve. She put it away carefully and said, "If you can find her, why do you need to carve these cold statues?" Ning Ke was a little embarrassed and said, "I'm mainly learning how to break stones." Tang Xiaotang patted her chest and said, "If you want to learn, I can teach you." Many years ago, on the streets of Chang'an, there was a little girl whose chest could break stones. After so many years, she was still as heroic as ever. Ning Ke recalled the scene and felt a little emotional. As a youngest uncle, it was not convenient for him to see where her hands were. But Chen Pipi didn't have such a taboo. He murmured and sighed, "It's not big." Outside the Lang temple, thousands of followers of the new stream were waiting for Chen Pipi and Tang Xiaotang. They were going to the Song Kingdom. Just like Ning Ke killing people from thousands of miles away, they were preaching from thousands of miles away. The scroll had been entrusted to them. Ning Ke didn't want to waste their time and sent them out of the temple. After Chen Pipi and Tang Xiaotang left, he continued to carve Buddha statues. Well, statues of Sang Sang. He made hundreds of statues of Sang Sang and lined them up in front of the hall. The statues of Sang Sang were either deep in thought, looking up at the sky, or looking at the world with their hands behind their back. There was only one thing in common: they were expressionless. The autumn rain fell from time to time, and the statues of Sang Sang were wet from time to time. He squinted and stared, holding his waist and arms, admiring the changes of the stone statues in the autumn rain. The situation of the world continued to change as time went by. The flames of war were everywhere, and the killing intent was everywhere. The war between the Tang Empire and Taoism had both wins and losses. The strategy of the West Hill Divine Palace played a certain role. The most important thing was that the Tang Empire, or the Academy, still couldn't find a way to cross that small town. In fact, Ning Ke didn't care much about that small town. Not many people could guess his thoughts. Long Qing was one of them. He stood in the bleak autumn wind at the top of Qingjing city of the Yan Kingdom, quietly waiting for Ning Ke's arrival. Many people had always thought that the battle between Ning Ke and Long Qing was inevitable and would happen at any time. However, unexpectedly, Ning Ke didn't come, and the battle never happened. Ning Ke looked at Sang Sang in the Lank Temple in the autumn rain. What was Sang Sang looking at now? The night in the cold region of the far north was long and cold. The hot sea had long been covered with thick snow. The light in the yurts left by the desolate man's tribe seemed to be frozen to pieces. Sang Sang sat by the light and looked at her fingertips. There was a bubble on her fingertip. The surface of the bubble was smooth, and it looked crystal and transparent under the light. The shape was extremely perfect. The indigo lion lay at her feet and looked at the bubble. Its eyes were full of curiosity, but it was instinctively afraid. It always felt that if it broke the bubble with its claws, the world would be destroyed. Ning Ke looked at the two cracks on the surface of the rock in the Lank Temple. There seemed to be two tiny cracks on the surface of the bubble between Sang Sang's fingers, and it would burst in the next moment. Like the hundreds of stone statues in the Lank Temple, her face was still expressionless. But it didn't mean indifference. It was more like calmness. She gently stroked her bulging belly. There was a delicious smell of soup coming from the corner of the yurt. In the morning, the indigo lion hunted a snow chicken. She was making chicken soup. I suddenly don't want to use my chest to break the big stone, or I may continue to use it in the next chapter. Well, it was hard today. Fortunately, I can sit up in the end. Chapter 11-13. Firstly, I want to thank those students. Secondly, regarding the heavenly power pill, I really forgot about it. Yesterday, when I was writing it, I tried to recall it seriously, only to realize that memory is really the most unreliable thing. Thank you to the students who pointed it out. I deeply apologize and will make changes. Lastly, wanting to write a different and awesome plot is really a painful thing, especially when one's ability isn't particularly strong. We will succeed. Thank you. Chapter 11-14. The bubble on Sang Sang's fingertip was perfect, but it was not a perfect circle. It had curves and an indescribable sense of beauty, just like her bulging belly. It seemed fragile, but it was incomparably firm. It was space itself. She was expressionless, but she was not indifferent, just calm. It seemed that the two cracks on the bubble and the bulging belly indicated something or the future, which was constantly changing her. A Taoist dressed in green suddenly appeared at the edge of the forest beside the cold snow sea. He changed the direction of the wind and the temperature of the field. He was the strongest person in the world now, possessing the wisest and far-sighted vision. However, the strange thing was that he turned a blind eye to the faint light in the yurt. He didn't turn a blind eye to it, but he really didn't see it. He didn't see the oil lamp, didn't see the steam rising from the pot of snow chicken soup, and didn't see Sang Sang by the window because Sang Sang didn't want him to see her. With a thought, he isolated the wooden yurt by the sea from the real world. That was the world of Haotian, and even he could not see it. Chen Mao stood quietly at the edge of the frozen forest, looking at the snow dancing wildly on the surface of the hot sea like smoke and dust, looking at the footprints of the beasts that were gradually covered by the wind and snow. Although he did not see what he wanted to see, he did not leave, because he had an intuition that the person he had been searching for should be here. Sang Sang sat quietly by the window. The dim light of the oil lamp shone on her chubby cheeks, and her hand fell on her bulging belly, motionless. She did not look at him by the forest, nor did she do anything, not even think. This was the 7th time the Mao had come to the cold snow sea to find her. Every time he came, he would get closer to her. He did not know whether he would see her face and approach her world the next time he came. The late autumn night in the north was extremely long, as if it would never stop. Only at certain moments would the sun show its face. The Mao stood by the forest for a whole night. His eyes were dazzled by the red sunlight, and he once again looked at the wooden yurts around the snow sea. After confirming that there was no trace of her, he disappeared again. In the corner of the yurt, the indigo lion lying by the stove was motionless. It was instinctively afraid of the human being, especially after seeing its owner silenced several times. It realized how terrifying the human being was. For the whole night, it didn't even dare to breathe, let alone wagging its tail to beg its owner to give it a drumstick. The indigo lion heaved a sigh of relief when the man finally left. It stood up on all fours and shook its head to make its slightly numb body more active. When it was about to show off to Sang Sang, it found that Sang Sang was still in the same position as last night, sitting quietly by the window without thinking, as if she didn't know that it had left. Soon after the sun rose, it fell into the dark ocean again. Sang Sang looked at the cold world outside the window. When the oil lamp burned out, the figure in green clothes appeared again in the woods. Sang Sang was still sitting quietly. Chen Mao left again. She sat there quietly, not sleeping, not eating, not talking, not thinking, not moving. A cold wind that didn't belong to nature blew, and the aura of heaven and earth changed slightly. A scholar in a cotton-padded jacket appeared in the woods. He looked around, as if he was looking for something. He was covered with dust, haggard, and extremely thin. He hadn't rested for a long time, and the cold wind could knock him down at any time. Sang Sang finally moved. She turned her head and shifted her gaze from the snow-covered sea to the woodland. Her eyes fell on the scholar, and a complicated emotion appeared in her indifferent eyes. She suddenly wanted to walk out of the yurt and go back to her own world. Because she felt that the scholar was trustworthy, but also a little scared and disgusted. So she didn't do anything in the end. The drunkard finally arrived the second day after the eldest brother left. He was the most powerful man who had experienced the everlasting night. The flagon on his waist swayed in the wind and snow, as if the wine in it had been drunk. Sang Sang didn't even look at him, nor was she as silent and cautious as the Chen Mao when he appeared. Finally, they all left. Sang Sang stood up by the window and walked to the stove. She looked at the pot of chicken soup that had long been boiled dry, and smelled the pungent burnt smell. She was silent for a long time. He didn't go home that night, so that she could finish the chicken soup in case it went bad. Did he finish the chicken soup in the end? Sang Sang thought of the note, and her right hand gently stroked her bulging belly. She suddenly felt very lonely and wanted someone to accompany her. All this happened when she thought of that person. This was her world. In this world, time was still passing, the chicken soup would be boiled dry, and the life in her belly would keep growing. She was getting weaker and weaker. If she couldn't maintain this world, it would be the moment of danger. She put the pot of burnt chicken in front of the indigo lion, and ignored its pitiful look. She took out an abacus from under the table and began to calculate the possible dangers and solutions. She had to provide endless nutrients for the little life in her belly, and at the same time, she had to be isolated from the human world. She didn't have enough energy to calculate like before. Her chess skills were still unbeatable, and she was still unbeatable at the poker table. Neither Chen Pipi nor Song Qian and other human geniuses were her opponents. But she couldn't calculate everything in the world. She had to rely on humans' calculation tools to reason and calculate those important things. She was the rule of this world. However, after she came to the human world, she was contaminated by the mortal world, and her speed was not as fast as those three human beings. This was a very dangerous thing. If she had to escape, how could she be faster? Clap, 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 clap. The crisp sound of plates hitting against each other came from the dark yurt. It sounded like a cheerful song. The indigo lion was gnawing on the burnt chicken bones, happily wagging its tail. Song Song's right hand moved quickly on the abacus, leaving a series of residual shadows. She looked calm and focused. The perfect bubble appeared in her left hand again. On the smooth surface of the bubble, more than 10 light spots appeared. If compared with the map of the human world, those light spots were Helan City, Chang'an, the West Hill, the Kingdom of Song, the Lang Temple, the depths of the West Wilderness, the beginning or the end of those space passages. The last autumn rain fell, and the central plains were extremely cold. The war in the human world had finally reached the last step. The Tang Empire reorganized its navy, and tens of thousands of ships raced to the South Jin Kingdom. The South Jin Kingdom, which had been frightened by Ning Kei's killing of their emperor and ministers, had no power to resist. Coupled with the reputation of the sword Garrett, the gate of Lincoln was opened within 10 days. The army of the Great River Kingdom also crossed the surging Yellow River and headed north. The Divine Chariot and the Royal Chariot led tens of thousands of people of the Great River Kingdom. They did something that no one had dared to think of for generations. They marched towards the West Hill Divine Kingdom. The Tang army had entered the border of the West Hill Divine Kingdom and was less than 200 miles away from Peach Mountain. The sacred sedan of judgment had arrived at the Miyu town in the south and was only 300 miles away from Peach Mountain. The West Hill Divine Kingdom was besieged from both the north and the south. Although they had recalled all the powerhouses of Hautian Taoism and tens of thousands of cavalrymen of the Divine Halls had set up several lines of defense around Peach Mountain, everyone knew that the Divine Halls were in danger. On the balcony of the White Divine Palace on the peak of Peach Mountain, Xiong Chumo was looking at the human world shrouded by the autumn rain. His haggard face was filled with frustration. He did not know what else he could do. It seemed that it was the last moment for him to conclude his life, but he did not know how to conclude it. Where was the Abbey Dean? What was he doing? Why didn't Hautian respond to the prayers of the devout believers? Why was it that the blasphemers had won one victory after another, but the heavenly messenger had yet to arrive? What was going on? Was Hautian Taoism, which had ruled the world for countless years, going to be destroyed? Xiong Chumo was enraged out of desperation. The filthiest words and the most vicious curses burst out from his mouth and resounded through the entire Peach Mountain like thunder. Those words were meant for the Abbey Dean. However, even at this moment, he still did not dare to say the Abbey Dean's name, which made him look extremely pitiful. The mountain wind blew and dispersed the misty rain, revealing the small town at the foot of the mountain. In the autumn wind and rain, the town was still as tranquil as the sky, unaffected. Looking at the town, Xiong Chumo gradually calmed down. Even if the Abbey Dean was not coming back, as long as that person was there, the Tang and the Academy would not be able to get close to Peach Mountain. Then there was nothing to worry about. There were still many things to worry about. Xiong Chimo looked at the distant mountain in the autumn rain. He seemed to have seen Su Shi's flag and the fearsome armored cavalry of the Tang army. He felt the weight on his shoulders getting heavier. Long Qing still refuses to bring the rest of the people back. What is he doing? Is he really going to disobey the decree? And what is he doing in Yan Kingdom? Waiting to be killed by Ning Ke? Xiong Chimo roared angrily in a low voice. The middle-aged priest stood beside him and said calmly, if he can really keep Ning Ke in Yan Kingdom, it will be a great achievement for the divine halls. Xiong Chimo sneered, that depends on whether he has the ability or not. The middle-aged priest said calmly, if he can't, then no one else can. Xiong Chimo slightly frowned and turned to him. He did not expect that the priest would have such a high opinion of Long Qing. He said carefully, Hengmu was killed by Ning Quebec. Long Qing has not even passed the 5 states. How can he be a match for him? Years ago, I saw Long Qing climb up from the abyss. If Hengmu and Long Qing fought, Hengmu would be the one to die. As for Long Qing and Ning Ke, who is stronger and who will be the final winner, no one else has the right to judge. They can only fight for the last time. The middle-aged priest said calmly. He had always played the role of a bystander in Taoism. He knew more than most people, so he was calmer. Xiong Chimo paused for a while and said, the enemy is coming. Taoism has to do something. The middle-aged priest looked at the small town in the autumn rain and said, I will go and have a look. Chapter 11:15. There was only one butcher's shop in the town. There was only one butcher in the world. The middle-aged Taoist stood outside the door and looked at the butcher who was covered in grease but no sweat. He said, since you are here, you have to do something. The butcher was dividing the pork. Hearing this, he kept silent for a long time and asked in a hoarse voice, is your senior brother really going to do that rebellious thing? The middle-aged Taoist said calmly, what do you mean by rebellious? First of all, we have to determine the concept of Taoism. You and the drunkard have been hiding under Haotian's eyes for tens of thousands of years. Isn't that against her Taoism? The butcher's ink-like thick eyebrows slowly rose as he said, how dare you? The middle-aged Taoist said, helping my senior brother is also good for you. The butcher said, to help your senior brother, I just need to stay in the town and not come here. Because you and I both know that helping your senior brother and helping Taoism are two different things. The middle-aged Taoist kept silent for a while and said, the agreement between you and Haotian is still valid. The butcher remained silent for a long time. At first it was because he needed time to think about what the Abbey Dean wanted him to do. Later, it was because someone had come. Hearing the footsteps, he asked, what do you need me to do? The middle-aged Taoist stood outside the door and did not look back at the approaching figure. He said, the Tang army is armored and heavy cavalry. No one can stop them. I don't want the divine hall to be peaceful forever. I just want some pavilions and halls. The butcher put down his knife and said indifferently, is that all? The middle-aged Taoist said, if you can kill the people from the academy, it will be the best. The butcher and the drunkard were the two grand cultivators who had lived the longest in the world, even longer than the Buddha Yard and the headmaster of the academy. They had been living in seclusion until the headmaster ascended to heaven and Haotian came to the world. During these years, the drunkard had fought several times, which made the academy feel pressured. But the butcher had never done anything. Of course, he was strong, even the strongest in the world. He was different from the chief monk of scripture who had been buried with the Prajna peak. He was strong, but his blade was even stronger because he was good at killing. For countless years, he had killed pigs, sheep, cows, and people. His strength lay in killing. He had lived in seclusion for many years and had killed fewer people. It was not because of a change in his state of mind, but because of the headmaster's request. The butcher said with an indifferent expression, they're just some pigs and sheep. There's no harm in killing them. As soon as he finished speaking, the sound of cicadas rang out in the small town. At this time, the autumn rain was chilly, and the sound of cicadas in the rain was even more mournful. Amidst the sound of cicadas, a little girl in a yellow dress slowly walked over from the other side of the town. She walked to the butcher's shop and looked inside. The rainwater at the end of her ponytail was like fine pearls. As she moved, it floated to the ground inside the threshold. Then, the tip of her nose wrinkled beautifully. It was very cute. She thought the smell of blood in the butcher's shop was too strong and unpleasant, just like the butcher's words. Others are pigs and sheep, but you are a dog. I've never understood why people like you and the drunkard are willing to be dogs. Is this matter really that interesting? Yu Lian's young face was full of inquiry. Because of her seriousness, she looked very cute. Her yellow dress was wet by the rain, but she did not look embarrassed. Instead, she was still cute. Her black ponytail was naturally the cutest. She was such a cute and scary little girl. She had recovered from the wounds she suffered in the battle with the national master of the Golden Tribe in the wilderness. She did not stop and traveled thousands of miles south to the West Hill Divine Kingdom. How could the tens of thousands of cavalrymen from the divine halls of West Hill stop her? It was not until she came to the door of the butcher's shop that the divine halls of West Hill noticed her arrival. The sharp warning sound cut through the rain, and the sound of hoofbeats could be heard. Countless people came to the small town, but did not dare to step on the long street. The butcher looked at the little girl outside the butcher's shop and guessed her identity. He said expressionlessly, "It's better to be a dog in peace than a person in chaos. This is what your teacher said to me in the town." Yu Lian's eyes fell on the knife in his hand. She said casually, "What he said might not be right." The butcher said, "I heard that you are this generation's leader of the Devil's Doctrine. The Devil's Doctrine emphasizes on absorbing the chi of heaven and earth into the body, which is similar to what I realized years ago. In this way, I should be your ancestor. But since you don't even care about what the headmaster of the academy said, I guess you don't care about this either." Yu Lian put her hands behind her back and stood on tiptoe to look into the butcher's shop. She looked like a cute little girl who was learning from adults. She said casually, "The Enlightenment doctrine has always been good at deceiving and destroying our ancestors." The butcher said indifferently, "You are an interesting kid. No one has dared to talk to me like this for many years. Maybe you can be proud of it." He had lived in the world for countless years. In terms of age, he could call everyone a kid. Yu Lian was not annoyed. She looked at him and said, "I also think you are interesting." The butcher asked, "Where?" Yu Lian said slowly, "No one has ever dared to talk to me like this except for my teacher. I think he was the one who talked to you like this many years ago. It seems that he is more powerful." The butcher was silent for a moment and suddenly threw the knife in his hand. The butcher's knife, which was covered in blood and oil, fell heavily on the ground outside the sill with a loud bang. Smoke and dust rose, and gravel shot into the dense autumn rain. It was as if a mountain had fallen from the sky to the mortal world. "If you can hold this knife, we will talk about other things," he said. Yu Lian squatted down with her hands behind her back and looked at the legendary knife for a while. Then she carefully rolled up her sleeves and took out a handkerchief. She pinched the back of the knife with only 2 fingers through the handkerchief. She used 2 fingers to slowly lift the heaviest knife in the world off the ground. As she moved, the weight of the iron knife passed to her feet. With 2 crisp sounds, 2 cobweb-like cracks appeared on the bluestone floor outside the door sill of the butcher's shop. Throughout this process, her brows were furrowed and her expression was solemn. Then she put down the iron knife. "Very good. You are qualified to talk to me." The butcher looked at her coldly and said, "Although it was a bit hard, you lifted it after all." Yu Lian shook her head and carefully wiped her fingers with the handkerchief. She said, "You old people always like to talk to yourselves. I just think it is too dirty. Do you think it is really heavy? She frowned and concentrated because she did not want her fingers to be stained with blood or oil. The butcher was silent for a long time and said, "You are indeed very strong. Thank you for your recognition, Senior." Yu Lian said casually. She was not serious at all. Her strength did not need anyone's approval, even if that person was the legendary butcher. If you were given the same time as me, no, even half or even 1/10 of my time, you might be able to defeat me and even obtain the real immortality. The butcher looked at her and said, "Unfortunately, you will not have that time anymore. So you are not strong enough. No matter who comes from the academy, it is not enough because you are not strong enough." Yu Lian said, "You have not been in the world for many years. You do not know that the strongest thing in the academy is the word strong." The butcher said, "Do you want to talk about Ning Ke who inherited Kuharan's legacy? He is indeed good. Unfortunately, 1,000 miles of wind blew in Yangzhou City. Now he is, lacking breath." As soon as he finished speaking, he raised his eyebrows again. Footsteps were heard in the autumn rain again. The footsteps were very steady. A powerhouse like the butcher could naturally hear that there was something wrong with the center of gravity of the person's body. However, it was still so steady, which meant that it was terrifying. The person was wearing a shabby monk's robe. His short hair was like angry pine, but his expression was very calm. He walked in the rain, and the distance between each step seemed to be measured with a ruler in advance. There was no deviation. Jun Mo had always been a person who would never make a mistake. The butcher looked at him with a serious expression and said, "Or, would you like to try and see if you can pick up my knife?" Jun Mo took the handkerchief from Yu Lian's hand and carefully wiped the rain off his face. He glanced at the knife on the ground and did not understand what the butcher was talking about. He looked at the butcher as if he was looking at an idiot. Yu Lian looked at the butcher as if she was looking at an ignorant child. She said, "I said that you don't care about the world, and you really don't. You have no idea that the strongest person in the academy has never been Ning Quebec. Indeed, the strongest people in the academy had always been Jun Mo and Yu Lian. The butcher was perhaps the strongest person in the cultivation world or even in the entire history of cultivation. The strongest here did not refer to the state of cultivation, but specifically referred to the strength and strength. Therefore, the two strongest people in the academy came to meet him. The butcher was naturally not in a good mood to be looked at and ignored by two juniors of the academy. His face became a little gloomy, but he did not say anything. Yu Lian asked, "Is it enough now?" The butcher said, "It is enough. You can try to fight with me together." Yu Lian said, "The headmaster said that words must be justified, and it is very important. Jun Mo likes to use peaceful means before resorting to force. Therefore, since it is enough, maybe we can talk about something first." The butcher took a deep breath. He had been prepared for a real battle for countless years, but he was rebuffed by Yu Lian's words. His depressed mood turned into one word, "Speak." Yu Lian said, "It seems to be a little inconvenient today." The butcher squinted his eyes and slightly raised his eyebrows. He stared at her without saying a word. Yu Lian said, "I am not afraid of you. What's the use of staring at me?" Then she turned around and looked at the middle-aged Taoist. She said, "Do you know why it is inconvenient?" The middle-aged Taoist sighed and said, "I guess it is because I am here." "But powerful people, why do you care about me?" Yu Lian said, "Of course it is because you are very strong." The middle-aged Taoist smiled and said, "I have done nothing since the beginning." Yu Lian said calmly, "That is why it is so great. Until now, I do not even know your name. I have to say that it is very admirable." To the human world, she was a great fog. However, this seemingly calm and harmless middle-aged Taoist had silently guarded the Jishou Abbey for decades. Even she could not see through him. His true face seemed to be hidden in the fog, so it was naturally worth being vigilant. I have been feeling unwell these few days, and even have mental problems. I have been adjusting, and it is all right. Let's put our palms together, hug, and pat each other on the back. Everyone is strong. Chapter 11:16. The middle-aged Taoist did not smile or speak. He just stood aside quietly, as if Yu Lian's attention and Jun Mo's silence meant nothing to him. At this moment, the rain became lighter, and the sound of hooves and wheels rolling over stones came from the street again. The roasted sweet potato shop at the other end of the town was closed. The white-haired old man and the middle-aged man, father and son, sat in an ox cart in the drizzle. They stopped in front of the butcher's shop for a while, and the son came out with 2 hot roasted sweet potatoes. Yu Lian and Jun Mo took the roasted sweet potatoes and nodded. The old man wiped the raindrops from his white hair and patted the ox's thick neck. He said, "It will be difficult to eat in the town from now on." His family had been roasting sweet potatoes in the town in front of Peach Mountain for thousands of years. It had been passed down from ancestors to the present generation. In addition to keeping an eye on the Divine Hall for the academy, the most important reason was that the headmaster of the academy liked to eat the roasted sweet potatoes from his family in the original town. The battle was about to begin. The father and son left the town. Those cavalrymen of Divine Hall who were hiding in the rain and outside the town did not dare to stop them. They silently made way for them. Yu Lian tore open the slightly charred skin of the roasted sweet potato and used her little finger to pick out some red sweet potato flesh and put it into her mouth. She pursed her delicate lips and chewed for a while. She felt that although it was delicious, it was not as exaggerated as what her teacher had said. Jun Mo thought for a while and did not eat it on the spot. He wrapped the roasted sweet potato with a handkerchief and put it in his arms. Then he looked at the middle-aged Taoist. His eyes pierced through the autumn rain and fell somewhere. Yu Lian reminded him, "That handkerchief is mine." Jun Mo said, "That's my senior brother's." Yu Lian was a little annoyed and ignored him. She held the roasted sweet potato and looked at the butcher inside the gate. She said, "The Abbey Dean does not care about the survival of Taoism. You have no reason to care." She talked about the sweet potato and the handkerchief a moment ago, and then she talked about Taoism and the human world the next moment. Life and holiness were never easy to be unified and harmonious, so her words and deeds were a little cute. It was raining in the town today. She seemed to deliberately make herself go the way of cuteness. The butcher slightly raised his eyebrows and said, "How can a junior like you understand?" Yu Lian looked around and found there was no trash can on the street. She threw the roasted sweet potato that she did not want to eat on the ground and said, "Isn't it just betting on both sides?" Butcher's ink-black eyebrows rose higher and higher. Yu Lian said, "The drunkard went with the Abbey Dean." Whether he was helping or spying on the Abbey Dean, even if he was betting on the Abbey Dean, you came to the Peach Mountain to bet on the Taoism that was abandoned by the Abbey Dean. What I don't understand is why none of you are willing to bet on the academy. The butcher mocked, "Because there is no Haotian in the academy." Yu Lian looked at him expressionlessly for a long time before saying, "Does Taoism have it? Don't forget to bet on both sides. It's easy to miss out on both." The butcher was silent for a moment, then said, "If I kill you, I can stand on the riverbank and wait for the result to appear. No matter who wins, it won't do me any harm." Yu Lian asked, "Do you really want to see the end?" The butcher said, "Yes." Yu Lian said with a resentful expression, "It's really rotten. Apart from watching, apart from waiting like a dog, I don't dare to do anything else interesting." The butcher walked to the threshold of the butcher's shop and picked up the knife on the ground. Looking at the gray sky that was cut into countless thin strips by the autumn rain, he said, "When you live long enough, you will be as careful as us." Jun Mo didn't say much. Hearing the butcher's sigh, he said, "The longer you live so carefully, the more boring it will be." After saying this, he walked out of the town with Yu Lian. The autumn rain fell on the apprentice brother and sister, making them slightly wet. The rainwater on the street splashed with their footsteps. Standing at the entrance of the town in the autumn rain, Jun Mo said, "I didn't see it." Yu Lian frowned and said, "According to Yi Hongyu's memory, there should be some remnants of the arcane scroll of the fall. If it's not in the hands of that Taoist, where is it now?" At this moment, the middle-aged Taoist said from afar, "You too have come from afar. Why don't you go up the mountain and be our guests?" Yu Lian turned around and said to him, "Evil guests don't need to be invited. Let's skip it today." The middle-aged Taoist said, "Both of you, please enlighten me." Yu Lian said, "I am the Grand Master of the Devil's Doctrine who has entered the West Hill and is the closest to the Peach Mountain in the past 1,000 years. I am satisfied with this. If the butcher doesn't do it, why should I?" Jun Mo was more direct than her. He looked at the middle-aged Taoist and said, "I dare not enlighten you. I just want to send a message to the people of the Divine Hall. From today on, no one can leave the Peach Mountain." The middle-aged Taoist's expression changed slightly. At this moment, a thunder suddenly sounded in the rain clouds in the sky. More than 1,000 cavalrymen of the Divine Hall of West Hill, as well as the priests and deacons hiding in the woods, heard Jun Mo's words and the thunder, and were stunned and did not know what to say. It was a plain and casual sentence, but it was extremely domineering. As if to prove Jun Mo's words, the sound of horses' hooves could be faintly heard from the depths of the autumn rain. The earth trembled slightly, and the rainwater in the puddles trembled a little. It was obviously still far away, but because of the fierce momentum, it gave people a feeling that even the autumn rain was about to be blown away by the wind and thunder. In the north, Su Shi personally led the cavalry of the Tang Empire. They broke through the 3 lines of defense of the Divine Hall of West Hill in the morning and arrived at the bridgeside town, which was more than 40 miles away from the Peach Mountain. In the east, Monk Guanhai led hundreds of monk soldiers from the Lank Temple and marched silently in the autumn rain. As for the powerhouses of the Buddhism sect, including the chess masters, they should arrive sooner. In the west, the silver-haired Qing Lixue was gathering the old subordinates of the Divine Hall of Revelation in the Snow Tree Village. They were almost there. He looked at the Divine Hall of Revelation on the Peach Mountain, where he grew up, and sighed silently. In the south, countless Xiu swords flashed. In the gloomy valley, countless trees that were wet by the rain were cut by the swords. The blood-red sacred sedan and the pear-blossom white royal sedan, under the protection of tens of thousands of soldiers from the Great River Army, slowly approached the Peach Mountain. The deacons of the Divine Hall of West Hill they met along the way did not even dare to speak. The Peach Mountain was surrounded, and the Divine Hall of West Hill was in danger. Jun Mo said that from this moment on, people could only enter the Peach Mountain, but not leave. It was not that he was domineering, but that the Academy had the right to say this. What was shocking and puzzling was that the Academy did not immediately attack the Peach Mountain. Perhaps it had something to do with the butcher in the small town, or maybe it was because of some other reason. The Academy seemed to be waiting for something. At the same time, many people noticed that at such an important, or even final moment, Ning Ke and Long Qing were not there. One day before, Ning Ke finished his cultivation process of watching the stones crack in the Lank Temple. He looked at the hundreds of statues of Sang Sang in the rain in front of the temple and smiled with satisfaction. He picked out a statue that he was most satisfied with and put it in his arms. It was a statue of Sang Sang sleeping on her side. She was sleeping on the hot and hard Kong, but she was still curled up and wanted to crawl into someone's arms. Her feet were exposed outside the quilt, and they were as white as 2 snow-white lotus flowers. They were so tender that people would feel pity for them. He left the Tile Mountain in the autumn rain and once again embarked on his journey to find Sang Sang. But this time, he was much more confident. It seemed that he had a premonition, so he went straight to the north. Before the Tile Mountain was the kingdom of Song. There was a small town at the border between the kingdom of Song and the kingdom of Yen. On the day he walked into the town, it suddenly snowed. He heard that it was the first snow of the year. The only butcher's shop in the town was closed, but the calligraphy and painting shop was still open. The drunkard who liked to drink was nowhere to be found, so there was only the fragrance of tea and ink in the shop. Ning Kei walked into the calligraphy and painting shop and put the fried chicken he bought in the previous town on the table. He looked at the slightly hunched shopkeeper and said, "Have a drink with me?" Chao Xiaoshu turned around and looked at him. He shook his head, but still took 2 wine cups. Zhang San and Li Si heard the noise and rushed to the front of the shop. When they saw that it was him, they couldn't help but jump in fright. They subconsciously looked around and used their fastest speed to lift the door plank and close it before coming to greet him. "Greetings, youngest uncle." Ning Kei nodded and gestured for them to fill their own bowls with rice wine. He said, "The butcher is in the Peach Mountain, and the drunkard is chasing after senior brother. Don't worry about those things." Chao Xiaoshu said, "It took me a long time to set up this trap." Ning Kei said, "So you should be careful." "Well, I admit that I came here today to break this trap. I don't want you to continue with it." Chao Xiaoshu said, "Can you kill him?" Ning Kei was silent. With the drunkard's limitless and immeasurable state, even if eldest brother and third sister joined hands, they might not be able to kill him, let alone him. "I'm going to the north. I feel that something is wrong." He looked at Chao Xiaoshu quietly and said, "Go back to Chang'an. Your wife, children, and the old man are waiting for you." Chao Xiaoshu did not respond. He raised his wine cup and said, "Drink this cup." Ning Kei drank it up to show his sincerity. Chao Xiaoshu said, "Then leave." Ning Kei was driven out of the small town. He had to continue walking north with the stone statue. He did not know the specific location, but he knew it was in the north. The small town was between the Song and Yen. Not far from the small town, he entered the Yen territory. There was a river parallel to the Sisui River, flowing from the north to the south into the Great Swamp, and then into the Big River, and finally into the sea. Ning Kei rode the big black horse and galloped between the fields and hills on the east bank of the river. It was early winter, and the water in the river was condensed. The fog was thick, especially in the morning. It was not like the human world. Ning Kei felt that he saw his own reflection in the fog. The fog on the river seemed to have become a mirror. It was not until the morning sun rose and the fog dissipated that he realized that there was no mirror in the fog. It was not his own reflection on the other side of the river, but a man on a horse like him. That man was also dressed in black and rode a black horse, looking very similar to him. The only difference was that Ning Kei wore a black academy uniform, while that man wore a black divine robe. That man was Long Qing. In fact, I wanted Chao Xiaoshu to say, "Let's go." Ning Kei said, "Let's go." Then he drank the wine in the cup. When Chao Xiaoshu drank, Chao Xiaoshu said, "Then you go." I feel uncomfortable, but this chapter is well written. I am sure of this, so I feel a little comforted. Chapter 11:17. The title was purely made up of idle associations. Please forgive my divergent thinking. I'm sorry to tell you that Master has caught a cold and is not feeling well. Plus, he has been in a state of anxiety recently, so he has decided to take a break today and think about the plot later. Please forgive me, dear readers, I'm sorry. Chapter 11:18. This river had many names. It was called the Wei River in the 20 miles around the Tang border. It was called the Yi River in the Yen Kingdom, also known as the Juma River. In the Song Kingdom, it was called the Tongtian River because one of its tributaries flowed directly into the Storm Sea. The Song Kingdom always insisted that it was the main river and completely ignored the fact that it was still more than 700 miles away from the Great Swamp. No one called it the Great River because there was already a great river in the south of the human world. But this river was actually very large with abundant water and wide waves. The wind blew through the paddy fields and the flowers bloomed on both sides. It had nurtured countless people. Especially in the area before and after the Yen border, the river was extremely wide. No matter how good one's eyesight was, it was difficult to see the face of the person on the other side of the river and naturally could not recognize who it was. But Ning Ke looked at the other side of the river and recognized that it was Long Qing. It was an indescribable feeling, as natural as the great river flowing into the sea, or perhaps it should be said that it was only natural. The world was so big and the Yi River was so cold. There were frequent wars and fires of war. Those who should have escaped had long escaped and walked in the wilderness. But someone appeared on the other side of the river. Of course, that person could only be Long Qing. The big black horse stopped and Ning Ke looked at the other side. At the same time, Long Qing also stopped and looked at him. Their eyes met on the surging river. He did not say, "So you are also here," but simply said, "I see you, so you can't leave." After a moment of silence, Ning Ke pulled the reins lightly and continued to gallop north. Long Qing also galloped north on the other side of the river. His horse was obviously extraordinary as it could keep up with the big black horse. Ning Ke was a little hungry and stopped at a bend in the winter sky. He took out some dry food and began to eat with the river water. Long Qing also stopped and took a few sips from his wine bag to quench his thirst. Ning Ke stopped and picked up some branches to make a bonfire. He allowed the big black horse to wander around and rest while he sat by the fire to roast the wild wheat. He roasted it until it was slightly burnt and fragrant. Then he threw it into his mouth and began chewing. Not long after, a bonfire was also lit on the other side of the river, which was particularly eye-catching in the early night. Ning Ke woke up when the morning sun shone on the earth. He walked to the shore and scooped up a handful of chilly river water. He washed his face and looked up, only to see Long Qing drawing water with a leather bag. He did not even look at him. Ning Ke continued north while Long Qing continued to follow him on the other side. The two of them did not speak, maintaining absolute silence. There was no threatening look in their eyes, not even a hint of hostility. Naturally, there were no flying swords, arrows, peach blossoms, or divine talismans. Deep in the Yen territory, the river turned west and entered a valley that was not high. The river was much narrower than yesterday, and the people on the other side could see it more clearly. Ning Ke and Long Qing and Ning Ke were still as they were. Whether it was the left bank or the right bank, the banks of the river always looked the same. There would be water plants, sand, stone steps in populated areas, bluestones used to wash clothes, waste thrown into the river by people on boats, rotten vegetable leaves floating on the surface of the water, and winding lines. But the two sides of the river were always parallel to each other. They would only meet each other if they went back to the source or entered the great swamp or the sea. Enemies were often the most similar to each other. They had been competing with each other for many years and seemed to know each other very well. But in fact, they had never really touched each other. They just looked at each other. The higher they went upstream, the colder the wind became, and the narrower the Yi River became. Ning Ke could already see Long Qing's eyebrows and eyes very clearly. He could see the scar that had faded a lot. Long Qing could also see the few very inconspicuous freckles on his cheeks and the straw rope wrapped around the hilt of the iron cutlass on his shoulder. 2 days after entering the North Yen mountain range, they reached the end of the mountains and the end of the river. There was endless fog, like white clouds rising from the ground. It was as beautiful as a fairyland and covered both of them. There was an angry sound of water coming from the clouds, crashing into the cliff and shattering into countless pieces. One could imagine how steep the invisible river became in the valley. Ning Ke got off the horse and looked at the other side of the fog. He did not know if Long Qing was there. At this moment, Long Qing's voice came from the fog. What did you write? Ning Ke and Long Qing were considered by many to be lifelong enemies. In fact, their fates had always been intertwined over the years. The two of them rarely met, but every time they did, it would be a matter of life and death. Every time they met, the outcome would affect them, and even the broader fates and futures. They met by the Yi River and walked silently on both sides of the river. They did not say a word but only compared each other by the bonfire. They did not start to talk until they reached the end of the mountains and could not see each other. However, Ning Ke did not expect that the first thing Long Qing said would be this. It made his pupils shrink. What did Ning Ke write with the blood of the barbarians on the grassland outside the city of Wei? He went to the Lank temple and saw the stone broken into 3 halves in the autumn rain. Did he write? If he did, what did he write? Was it the last volume of the Doctrine of the New Stream that was handed to Chen Pipi? Or what? Everyone is in the West Hill. Why did you come here? Ning Ke did not answer Long Qing's question. Although Long Qing's first words had exposed his thoughts, he felt that the proverb did make sense: the person who knew you best was often your enemy. Long Qing's voice came from the fog again, because you are here. Ning Ke's expression did not change. He untied the iron bow on his shoulder and seemed to want to rest here for a while. Long Qing's meaning was very clear. For Taoism or the human world, the final battle in the West Hill Divine Palace was important, but it was not as important as Ning Ke's whereabouts. Many people are guessing when I will go to capital Qing to kill you. But I don't think so. Other than the fact that I don't like being watched, the more important reason is that I am not sure that I can kill you. I know you will not go to capital Qing to find me, so I have been waiting for you at the border. There are countless idiots in the world who always think that there will be a battle between you and me. Have you become so stupid that you have to act according to the plot in the story? I have said that I am not sure that I can kill you. Besides, I have killed Ada and Hengmu. It is boring and monotonous to kill them in order. It is not in line with the aesthetic of the academy. Ning Ke calmly looked at the iron bow on his knees. He did not know when, but a dark iron arrow from the quiver was already in his hand. The whole process of taking out the arrow did not make any sound. He was telling the truth. Long Qing was indeed very powerful now. How could a person who even eldest brother could not see through not be powerful? More importantly, the Abbey Dean had given Long Qing the most important mission of killing Yi Su to help him become a sage. It was not easy to kill such a person, so why would he take the risk to kill him? However, Ning Ke knew that he was also very powerful. According to the proverb, Long Qing should know that he was powerful and not easy to kill. He did not want to fight with Long Qing, so why did Long Qing stop him? You killed people all over the world because you were looking for someone. Others might not understand, but I do. You killed Hengmu and Ada just to find her. You always thought that since they said it themselves and the whole human world was talking about them, that they were her gifts or children in the human world, then you could get some information by killing them. Deep in the clouds, Long Qing's voice sounded again after a moment of silence. I am different. I am not a gift left by Haotian to the human world. From that moment on, I am not qualified to be her son. Of course, I am not interested in such a title now. I am nothing. I have betrayed her. I only believe in myself. Under such circumstances, it is meaningless for you to kill me. Why take the risk? Ning Ke's fingers gently stroked the bowstring that was as hard as stone and as stable as a mountain. He said, yes. Long Qing said, you will not come to kill me, but I will come to you, because I feel that you are getting closer to finding her. I have different thoughts from the headmaster. I think you are the most likely to find her. I cannot let you continue. I don't care what you are going to write in the end. I cannot let you write anymore. Ning Ke raised his head and looked deep into the clouds. He said, "You think highly of me." Long Qing's voice came, "Those who look down on you are all dead." Ning Ke was silent for a moment and said, "I used to look down on you when you wanted to be her maidservant." Long Qing said, "Yes. Looking back at that time and thinking about her identity, I am so stupid and arrogant." Ning Ke said, "You used the word idiot first. You are so strong that I have nothing to say." Long Qing said, "Thank you." Ning Ke continued, "Later on, I shot you on the snow cliff, but you survived. You survived shamelessly. You made me vigilant because I also survived like that. In fact, you almost killed me in the autumn rain at the Red Lotus Temple." Long Qing's voice sounded a bit regretful, "But I still couldn't kill you." Ning Ke said, "Now that I think about it, it is all God's will." Long Qing agreed, "Hao Tian was always by your side. God's will belongs to you." Ning Ke said, "If I were you, I would not be convinced either." Long Qing said, "Nothing." Ning Ke said, "Otherwise, why are you here now?" He had asked this question before and Long Qing had already answered it. In order to prevent him from finding Sang Sang, in order to prevent him from writing that word, for Taoism or the human world, for many glorious, great, and just things, but he repeated his question. Long Qing was silent for a long time, and then gave a new answer. "Yes, this is an unnecessary battle. Hao Tian, Taoism, the human world, and the word you wrote are all excuses. I just want to see if I can kill you now, because I am not convinced." In the clouds, his voice was very calm, as if he was a naughty child who had torn off his clothes and played in the mud by the river naked. It was so real that it made people sigh with emotion. It was silent, except for the sound of the water. Ning Ke stood up and looked at the source of the voice in the clouds. He did not speak for a long time. Long Qing also did not speak for a long time. The world was very big. They did not meet many times, but every time they met was unforgettable. Ning Ke won 3 times in a row. Ning Ke won 3 times in a row. Because of the iron arrow, Long Qing became a disabled person. He abandoned his fiancée and became a devil in the darkness. He learned the gray eyes skill and betrayed Taoism. He thought he had mastered it and ambushed Ning Ke in front of the Red Lotus Temple. He did not expect Ning Ke to learn the practice of Tao Tai. Even if they were like 2 wild dogs biting each other, Ning Ke still won. There were many stories after that, generous, bitter, glorious, and heavy. They walked separately on both sides of the river according to their different fates, survived with difficulty, and continued to shine. They really met at the end of the mountain and sat down to discuss Taoism. It was not about the Taoism of life and death, but only one word. He was not convinced. Since there was Ning Ke in the world, why was there still a need for him? Long Qing was not convinced. This story had gone on for too long, and it was time to end it. It did not matter whether there was a reason or not. Ning Ke quietly looked at the depths of the clouds and felt the willpower, feeling very emotional. He had felt that willpower in many places. For example, the bottom of the Daming Lake, and the cliff cave in the back of the mountain of the academy. He did not expect that Long Qing's unwillingness was so strong. He respected him very much. He raised the iron bow, aimed at the position confirmed by the conversation, and pulled the string without hesitation. With a buzz, the iron arrow left the string and disappeared instantly. His expression was still as calm as before, calm and cold-blooded. He said some words, recalled some of the past, and felt some respect and emotion. "But, I still want to kill you. Since you have been unconvinced for so long, then please continue to be unconvinced until the netherworld. It's not like the occasional cold my wife mentioned yesterday. Although it's an occasional cold, the cold is extremely severe. It's a good thing that I've spent the entire day writing this plot. Naturally, there will be some readers who won't be very happy about it, but I really can't write anymore. The main reason is because this plot itself, in my opinion, is complete. More importantly, after writing the plot, I have a serious sense of mission completion. I feel like tomorrow will be a new day, blah, 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 I love you all. Chapter 11:19. The clouds were thick and the fog was thick. Only the sound could be heard, but no one could be seen. It was a good time to have a heart-to-heart talk, to review their lives, and to sigh with emotion. Even if they didn't want to forget the enmity, they should at least appreciate each other. Then they would straighten their clothes, point their swords at each other, and finish a lifetime of fighting as equals. Who would have thought that Ning Ke would suddenly attack with his strongest iron arrow? At such a beautiful moment, he used the most shameless sneak attack. If there was an audience, they would definitely be amazed by his shamelessness. A soft buzzing sound came from the steady string of the iron bow. The iron arrow pierced through the air and disappeared in the blink of an eye. The river hidden in the clouds splashed, and a clear and terrifying arrow hole appeared in the clouds. The opposite bank was in front of the arrow hole. There was no one and no sound. The iron arrow directly swept over the shallow hills on the opposite bank, flew to a faraway place, or fell into the storm sea. Ning Ke's calm and even cold-blooded sneak attack did not gain anything. Because his enemy today was the one who knew him best. He knew his shamelessness and coldness, and would not give him such a chance. But there were still some things that he didn't understand. Long Qing had been talking, and Ning Ke had been staring at the source of the sound. How could he be sure when Ning Ke would shoot and avoid it in advance? The arrow hole gradually disappeared. The chi of heaven and earth that was held hostage by the arrow dispersed in all directions, bringing with it countless tiny gusts of wind. Tens of thousands of tiny gusts of wind gathered together to form a violent current. In the whistling sound, the clouds and mist gradually dispersed. Looking at the opposite bank that was gradually becoming clear, Ning Ke's expression became very solemn. Many people appeared on the other side of the river. They were so densely packed that they looked like ghosts hiding among the rocks. These people exuded a powerful aura, and their eyes were dark and cold. Hundreds of gazes were coldly staring at him. The scene was extremely strange and terrifying. These powerful cultivators who followed Long Qing were now like a pack of wolves that had been hungry for many years. Ning Ke saw Long Qing. The man who had quietly said that he was not convinced and made everyone think that he would seek a fair fight with Ning Ke was now standing at the back of hundreds of powerful cultivators. He was very cautious and extremely dangerous, just like the aura exuding from his body, which gave people an indescribable feeling of complexity. The iron arrow missed, but it was like a signal that the battle had begun. Hundreds of cultivators rushed into the raging river amidst the deafening battle cries. The river upstream was not deep, just knee-deep. For a moment, water splashed everywhere, and the momentum was extremely frightening. Ning Ke did not draw out his iron cutlass. Instead, he held one end of the iron bow and waited silently. The first to arrive were naturally the flying swords. Several shining Taoist swords pierced through the chilly air and the remaining mist. With a hissing sound, they pierced toward his body. Ning Ke did not look at the Taoist swords. He only stared at Long Qing, who was gradually retreating into the depths of the forest behind the crowd. He did not even blink when the Taoist swords left several bright marks in his eyes. Several Taoist swords stabbed into his body almost at the same time. A series of strange sounds rang out from the shore. The sound was so loud that for a moment, it even drowned out the sound of the raging river. The sound was like a child holding a blunt knife, trying to cut open a pork trotter that had been smoked for 10 years, but could only watch in vain as the blade slid across the tough surface, leaving no mark. The sharp Taoist swords could not pierce through his skin at all. In an instant, Ning Ke burned the connection between the Taoist swords and the sword master with Haotian's divine flame. Accompanied by those strange sounds, the Taoist swords bent and then fell to the ground like scrap iron. He walked forward and suddenly saw that there was a cliff at the end of the valley after the mist dispersed. Under the cliff was a blue kidney sea, which looked very familiar, as if he had been there before. Yes, he had been there before. It was the place where he first met Mo Shanshan and the girls of Black Ink Garden. He suddenly missed her. Since Sang Sang left the human world, he had not thought about her and the other girls for a long time. But today, when the mist dispersed and the blue lake appeared, he suddenly missed them. He did not understand why. Or was it because he was not sure that he could defeat Long Qing, even if he left the shore? Although bones could be buried everywhere in Green Mountain, it was not a bad thing to die here, so he could look back a little. Those cultivators who came to attack on the river were the real powerhouses of Haotian Taoism. They had fought with Long Qing in the Yen Kingdom of the Eastern Wilderness for many years, so their fighting spirits and willpower were not ordinary. At this time, seeing Ning Ke's body was as hard as steel and could completely ignore the cutting of the Taoist swords, they did not feel any fear, nor did they slow down for a moment. The angry river was crushed by the footsteps. Hundreds of powerhouses of Haotian Taoism came from the other shore. They called back the Taoist swords flying in the air, held them tightly in their hands, and stabbed at Ning Quebec. This was the truth that Ji Haoran and Lu Bai taught all cultivators in the world: the closer the natal sword was to oneself, the better, so that the connection would be really close. The closer one was to the enemy, the better, so that he could ignore all defenses. A middle-aged man in leather armor, holding a sword, jumped to the air in front of Ning Ke with an indifferent expression, and chopped down without any fancy moves. The sword was so fast that it did not even have time to make a sound as it tore through the air. This sword was interesting and very powerful. No matter how powerful Ning Ke was, he could not completely ignore such a sword. He looked at the middle-aged man and felt that he was familiar. He remembered that he was a cavalry commander who was expelled from the Divine Hall of Judgment by Yi Hongyu, and was also one of the so-called fallen commanders who later became feared by the world. Ning Ke directly raised the iron bow, held the bow with his left hand, and his right hand fell on the string smoothly. He pulled it casually, and with a light buzz, the bowstring vibrated back to its original position. The cavalry commander was puzzled, because there were no arrows on the iron bow. How could he kill? The next moment, the cavalry commander's face became extremely pale, and a flash of light flashed in his gray eyes. With a roar, he pulled back his sword to protect himself, because he felt the killing intent. There were no arrows on the string of the iron bow, but there was a killing intent. Ning Ke released the string, and there was a sharp killing intent breaking through the air. With a soft sound, a clear corrosion mark appeared on the sword in the hand of the cavalry commander. With a crack, the sword broke in the middle. Then, a thin line of blood appeared on his wrist. Like a ripe fruit falling off the branch, the cavalry commander's hand fell to the ground. Ning Ke raised the iron bow and smashed a cultivator who tried to attack from the side to the ground. Without hesitation, he pulled the bowstring again and released the string at the cavalry commander who had just fallen to the ground. There was a light buzz, and someone was playing the zither. There was a line of blood on the cavalry commander's body. The line of blood ran from his left shoulder to below his ribs, and it was extremely deep. The next moment, the upper half of his body slipped from the lower half of his body, like a falling mountain. At this moment, the two sides of the turbulent and violent river were quiet for a moment. Today's cough is too uncomfortable, so this is all. Chapter 11:20. Who said that one could not kill without arrows? Many people would say so. When the sound rang in front of the river bank where the clouds and mist had dispersed, no one in the world had ever seen an empty string kill. Because when Ning Ke used the killing intent on the string to cut the commander's surname Z into dozens of pieces of flesh in the autumn rain in front of the Red Lotus Temple, Long Qing and his subordinates were fleeing down the mountain and did not see that scene. In the autumn rain, Ning Ke knew his destiny. From that moment on, he had the ability to kill with a bowstring. However, he had not used it in the following years. He had hidden this ability in the deepest part of the arrow case. It was only today when he faced the powerful cultivators that he revealed it to the world. Hundreds of powerful cultivators rushed over fearlessly. Ning Ke pulled the bowstring in silence. There was a soft hum. A heavy iron cutlass was cut in half. The powerful cultivator holding the cutlass had his right arm cut off. He let out a painful howl and fell into the river, unable to maintain his balance. A middle-aged man in a Taoist robe roared. The green sword in his hand turned into a swimming dragon, bringing the river water with it and the vigorous aura of heaven and earth towards his face. He raised the iron bow and pulled the bowstring at the swimming dragon formed by the river water. There was another soft hum. The water dragon was cut in the middle. A crack appeared on the middle-aged man's Taoist robe. The crack expanded rapidly and blood spurted out, dyeing the river water red. He fell heavily into the blood water and could no longer stand up. A powerful cultivator in a leather robe from the eastern tent pulled the bowstring and aimed at the opposite bank across the river. Ning Ke did not even look at it. He pulled the bowstring and shot. The killing intent swept through the surging water. It was wet and had a blurry shape. It arrived in front of the opponent at an unimaginable speed. With a crisp crack, the bow in the hands of the strong Eastern tribe barbarian broke in the middle. The bowstring split into two pieces and scattered in the air. The scattered strings were even more beautiful than the water splashes. The broken bowstring hit him hard in the face, smashing right into his eyes, causing a mixture of blood and juice to splatter out. However, the powerhouse from the eastern tent did not cry out in pain or wail. That was because the killing intent attached to Ning Ke's bowstring did not dissipate after cutting off his bow. Instead, it continued forward and directly cut off his neck. His head fell into the river like a stone. He only needed to bend the bow and did not need to put an arrow. It was a fake shot, but it had real killing intent. This was how Ning Ke killed people with the iron bow. His movements were steady. His right hand turned into a shadow. Neither sword nor arrow could be faster than the killing intent. Not to mention that killing intent was invisible and intangible. How could one guard against it? The rushing river water was instantly dyed red with blood. In just a single exchange, several experts had fallen to the ground. With his lightning-fast movements of controlling the bowstring, no one was a match for him at all. Ning Ke looked at the figure of Long Qing, who was about to disappear into the forest in the distance, and walked toward the river. At this time, the hundreds of cultivators had all come to his side, and the bloody battle continued. Ning Ke looked at the figure of Long Qing who was gradually disappearing into the forest in the distance. He walked toward the river. At this time, the hundreds of powerful cultivators had all come to his side. The bloody battle continued. Countless sword talismans, knives, and arrows danced in the air, cutting the air above the river into a turbulent cyclone. Just like the rushing river, there were countless dangers hidden in it. Even with Ning Ke's strong body, he still suffered some injuries under such a high density and intensity of attack. His black academy uniform was already torn and blood could be seen faintly under his ribs. But his expression was still calm. He walked silently to the other side of the river. He held the bow with his left hand and controlled the string with his right. From time to time, he raised his arm to aim and pulled the string with his right hand. The entire movement was stable to a perfect degree. He was not disturbed by any attacks. Those attacks wanted to kill him, but they could not kill him instantly. Therefore, those who wanted to attack him were all killed by his iron bow. No matter how sturdy the armor the person was wearing, or how strong his body was after practicing martial arts, he could not stop the bloodline from penetrating the deepest part of his flesh and bones until he was cut in half, or his limbs were severed, or he died. No one could stop Ning Ke from moving forward, not even those who risked their lives to attack. Hundreds of powerful cultivators were even forced to retreat by him alone. Hundreds of people were led to retreat by an iron bow. The sound of the string kept ringing, buzzing like the sound of a zither. It was very similar to the sound that rang in the square in front of the White Tower Temple in Yueluan Kingdom. The only difference was that eldest brother had broken hundreds of bowstrings that day in order to prevent Ning Ke from being killed. Today, Ning Ke kept pulling the string to kill people as quickly as possible. As he walked and shot, blood splattered and some people fell into the river. Ning Ke walked to the middle of the river. He stood on a slightly protruding rock and looked at the forest on the other side of the river. The river wind blew his hair. He was so silent and powerful. The 200 or so powerful cultivators who were still alive were either standing in the rushing river or on the shore. They looked at him with complicated expressions and temporarily stopped their attacks. It was not easy for an ant to shake a tree. I am invincible in the world. This sentence was used to describe Lu Bai. Ning Ke had not reached that state, but with the iron bow in hand, who in the world could be his opponent in close combat? Ning Ke looked at the forest and said, "Since you are not convinced, you should stand up and fight with me. Why send these people to their deaths?" Long Qin was not by the river. He was in the forest behind the cliff. He looked at the bloody scenes on the river in silence, his expression calm and serene. Ning Ke was very powerful. Although Ning Ke's ability to kill people with only an iron bow was beyond his imagination, he had expected this person to be so powerful, so he was not moved. When Long Qin heard Ning Ke's words, he didn't get angry because he was humiliated and mocked. Instead, he smiled silently because he knew Ning Ke was joking. He and Ning Ke would never appreciate each other because neither of them was a hero. They would never fight for the crown like Jun Mo and Yi Su because they were not gentlemen. Ning Ke used the most powerful primordial 13 arrows to sneak attack. How could he say that he was outnumbered? Long Qin knew his shamelessness. In order to defeat him, he had to be even more shameless. He could do anything to win. He could even sell his soul. What else could he care about? Taoism was already in a precarious situation. He would not return to Peach Mountain. The northeast border military of the Tang Empire had penetrated deep into the Yen territory. If his brother made a mistake, capital Qing would be slaughtered. He would not return to the old capital. He did not care about these. He only cared about Ning Quebec. Why? Because he was not convinced. How could he be convinced? Of course, he did not want to defeat him openly. He wanted to kill him. If he died, he would naturally be convinced. Between him and Ning Ke, the one who died first had to be convinced. Long Qin understood this. So did Ning Quebec. So Ning Ke's words were just a joke. That was why he laughed. Long Qin laughed because he knew he was about to win. Ning Ke had used up all his fu paper in the city of Wei and the Great Spirit in Qinghe Prefecture. He could still write fu, but he did not have any fu paper. If he wanted to write divine fu, he would need to use his psyche power. He could still use Haotian's divine light, but he did not have the Great Spirit that he had accumulated for many years. If he wanted to absorb the qi of heaven and earth into his body, he would need to use a lot of psyche power. Everyone knew that Ning Ke was the same as Yi Hongyu. They were both peerless geniuses who cultivated in several sections. After Xiahou, it was difficult for anyone to force him to use all his trump cards. It was even more impossible with his current state. However, he had traveled thousands of miles to kill people. Even if he meditated and recovered in the Lang Temple for a period of time, it was impossible for him to be as powerful as when he had just left Chang'an. He could not regain some skills in a short time. What Long Qing wanted to do was to force him to use up his psyche power. He lured Ning Ke to shoot the iron arrow. He made hundreds of the last, most loyal and most powerful subordinates attack fearlessly and die one after another. All this was to use up Ning Ke's psyche power. Psyche power was the foundation of cultivation. It was the firewood for fighting. It was everything. No one had ever thought of using up their psyche power to defeat Ning Quebec. This was because his psyche power was extremely powerful. This was also something that many people knew. However, Long Qing dared to think this way. Because only he knew a fact. No one's psyche power could be stronger than his. Not even Ning Ke. Tomorrow, my wife will be here. Everything will be better. I will recuperate as soon as possible. Then, I will gather enough energy to write the ending of the night. Please encourage me. Thank you. Chapter 11:21. Long Qing's confidence lay in the fact that he never fought alone. There were many people in his body, and there were also many people by the river. They were the powerful cultivators from Haotian Taoism and the Eastern Royal Court. They were not ordinary cavalries. Even if Ning Ke could fight against thousands of people, he could not completely ignore the attacks of these powerful cultivators. Ning Ke also noticed that the situation was a little strange today. None of the cultivators chose to retreat when faced with his iron bow. Instead, they were fearful of death and attacked wave after wave. The cultivator whose arm was cut off by Ning Ke changed his weapon to another hand and attacked again. The cultivator whose leg was cut off jumped and continued to attack with his companions. Those people looked pale. Every time they jumped, a lot of blood would splash out. They could die at any time, but they did not care. It was a horrifying scene. The horrifying scene meant a horrifying fighting will. Ning Ke stood on the reef and kept pulling the bowstring. He shot the enemies who approached him into the turbulent river. His expression did not change, but his heart was slightly stirred. How could such a strong and inhuman willpower appear in these people? Suddenly, he noticed that there was something wrong with the eyes of these powerful cultivators. They were not black like the ordinary people of the Central Plains, nor were they brown like the barbarians. Instead, they were a very strange gray, as dim as the lead clouds in the sky. More than 200 powerful cultivators rushed toward the river, surrounded and attacked. No matter how badly they were injured, they were calm and even a little numb. There was no fear in their gray eyes, only a desire to devour people and even an aura that was close to self-destruction. Looking at these hundreds of pairs of gray eyes, Ning Ke felt that he was surrounded by hundreds of hungry wolves. The surrounding air became a little cold, and he became very vigilant. The movements of his hands gradually slowed down. Slowing down the movements was not to slow down the attack, but to achieve the best effect with each attack. It would be best if he could directly cut off the opponent's waist or neck. If not, then he must at least cut off one of the opponent's legs to make it difficult for them to move and slow down their wolf-like attack. He was so cautious because he felt a sense of crisis deep in his heart. At this time, the river was full of Taoist swords and arrows. The chi of heaven and earth was cut into chaos by hundreds of psyche powers. No matter how fast his attack was, he had to pay a price every time, even if it was a wisp of psyche powers or a strand of hair. No matter how small the price was, it would still affect the final outcome of the battle. For example, an ant's nest was like a 1,000-mile-long dike, or an iron spoon was like a sturdy prison cell. Ning Ke had to be careful. Moreover, the gray eyes of these strong cultivators reminded him of the horrifying cultivation method that Long Qing had cultivated. He would not forget that Long Qing had not made a move until now. He must be hiding in the forest waiting for a chance. The river was still flowing fast, and the clouds had dispersed without a trace. There was no scorching sun in the sky, only a faint light, illuminating the battle on the cliff and the blue kidney sea not far below the cliff. Ning Kai continued to walk to the other side of the river. People kept falling in front of his iron bow, but at a much slower speed than before. His footsteps became heavier and heavier, just like his dignified expression. Long Qing was indeed looking for a chance, and he was sure that the chance would appear. He and Ning Kai knew each other too well. Conspiracies and tricks did not make much sense. Their states and cultivation methods were exposed to the sky and the sun. The so-called game could only be an open game, and then everything could be calculated. Under the continuous attacks of hundreds of strong cultivators, no matter how strong Ning Kai's psyche power was, it would inevitably be gradually consumed. No matter how cautious he was, he would eventually reveal a loophole. The mottled shadows of the forest leaves fell on Long Qing's face, as if adding countless scars. He quietly and attentively watched the battle in the river and watched Ning Kai walk down the reef toward him. Ning Kai's movements were still so steady, and his footsteps were also so steady, but too steady. He raised his hand to play the bowstring and threw his feet into the water. The rhythm was so precise that it was hard to imagine. However, it was this absolutely precise rhythm that gave off a slightly stiff feeling. The feeling of freedom that Ning Kai had shown at the beginning of the battle had unknowingly been worn away by the blood and broken limbs. He could only rely on precision to control the entire battle. If he wanted to control it, it meant that he was about to lose control. This was the chance that Long Qing had been waiting for. Suddenly, a cold and deadly cold wind blew through the forest. A dozen or so birds screeched in fear and scattered in all directions. However, before they could fly over the treetops, they were frozen stiff by the cold wind and fell to the ground. A thin layer of frost appeared on the ground. The frost extended out of the forest until it reached the river bank. It froze the first few waves that came ashore, and then thousands of layers of snow appeared. Long Qing's figure was like a ghost. He appeared on the rapid river and appeared in front of Ning Quebec. Behind him were two tracks that looked like ruts, faintly imprinted on the frost. The strange phenomenon of ice and snow on the river bank in the forest was caused by him releasing all the aura of quietus without hesitation at this moment. He rushed to Ning Kai at an unimaginable speed. At this time, Ning Kai had just pulled the string of the iron bow and shot a strong warrior from the eastern wilderness in half. He had just lifted his right foot and was about to step on the wet reef in front of him. He raised his hand and then threw his foot. There was a rhythm in between, which was not broken by the horrible sword intent and blade wind on the river. As long as he maintained this rhythm, he could keep moving forward without stopping. Long Qing had the power to break his rhythm, and it was at the most critical point of his rhythm. A silent black peach blossom, with an indescribable sense of quietus, descended from above and blasted toward Ning Kai's face. Ning Kai's left hand held the bow handle, and his right hand had just left the bowstring. He was in the follow-up movement of grasping the bird's tail. In a flash, Ning Kai retracted his right hand and held the lower end of the iron bow. His left hand held the middle part of the iron bow, and he pushed his hands forward to block the black peach blossom. The whole movement was done in one breath, as if he had already expected Long Qing to appear at this moment. But only he and Long Qing knew that it was not a matter of course. His rhythm was broken, and his psyche power was consumed. His right hand that grasped the bird's tail wanted to support the mountain, but after all, it was not enough. Long Qing stood on the reef and looked at him expressionlessly. His feet were as steady as roots. Ning Kai was in the river, and his right foot had not yet landed on the reef. He was swaying unsteadily. The dark iron bow was against the black peach blossom. The rushing river was quiet for a moment at this moment. Then, there was a loud bang. The black reef under Long Qing's feet was broken into countless pieces. Terrifying waves of air surged out in all directions. There was a clear deep plowed mark on the surface of the river. It was the mark of the water being cut open. It was the mark left by Ning Kei's feet on the surface of the river when he was shaken away. He swept across the river like a stone and smashed heavily into the cliff. Smoke and dust filled the air, and the earth shook. The river began to flow again, and it was still as rapid as before. Long Qing stood in the river. There was a lot of dust and water on his black divine robe. He was wet, and his hair was messy. His face was pale, and there was blood flowing from the corner of his mouth. He looked extremely embarrassed. However, his eyes were so bright as stars. Because he looked at the cliff on the other side of the river. The smoke and dust had dissipated, and there was a dark hole there. No one knew how deep Ning Kei had been smashed into the cliff. Long Qing knew that Ning Kei was not dead, but he knew that he had won this head-on battle without any tricks or skills. It was purely a contest of psyche power and state. This was important, so he smiled a little. After a moment, Ning Kei's voice came from the cliff. He sounded a little tired, but still stable. You used so many loyal subordinates to consume my psyche power, and then sneak attacked me. That's too shameless. I see that you are smiling now, and you seem to be very proud. Ning Kei walked out of the cliff and said to Long Qing in the river. His front was full of blood, not from the shock of the iron bow, but from coughing. Long Qing looked at him and smiled without saying a word. Those powerful cultivators, like hungry wolves, did not wait for orders. They passed by him and killed Ning Kei on the other side of the river. The sound of killing shook the sky again, and the aura of heaven and earth was cut into countless pieces by swords, knives, and arrows. Long Qing would not give Ning Kei any time or opportunity to meditate and recover his psyche power. The sound of the iron bow overwhelmed the sound of the surging water again, and began to harvest lives. Everything seemed to be the same as before. But in fact, everything was different. Ning Kei's movements were still stable, but more stiff. He still looked calm, but there was an emotion deep in his eyes that no one could understand. Those powerful cultivators were obviously controlled by Long Qing's secret method, or at least given some restrictions. After their eyes turned gray, their strength did not increase, but their willpower became extremely terrifying. They really pestered Ning Kei to the extreme, and if they were not killed or smashed, they would cause trouble for Ning Quebec. In many people's minds, as long as one's state was high enough, he could kill all enemies in the world. But they never thought that as long as one was human, he would always be tired, and his psyche power would eventually be exhausted. Ning Kei's psyche power was gradually consumed. It was not exhausted yet, but there were signs. At the moment when the signs appeared, the breath of death appeared on both sides of the angry river again, and the cold-resistant fish under the stones were all frozen. Long Qing came to him again. A black peach blossom bloomed and came to his face. Ning Kei did not smell the faint fragrance of the flower, nor would he appreciate the beautiful black petals. He stared at Long Qing behind the black peach blossom. His right hand, which was grasping the bird's tail, did not forcibly retract to hold the iron bow. Instead, he took the opportunity to hold the handle of the iron cutlass in the cold wind. There was a clang. The sharp iron cutlass was unsheathed, and the cold wind on the shore paused for a moment, and then tore it apart. He did not look at the black peach blossom that was rushing toward his face, but only stared at Long Qing behind the flower. The iron cutlass passed through the black peach blossom and cut toward Long Qing's face. He was very clear that if he let the situation develop, he might be exhausted to death. Even if he killed all of Long Qing's subordinates, it would be difficult for him to survive after Long Qing gained the upper hand. No matter how he looked at it, it was difficult to survive. Then, they could only die together. He looked at Long Qing. He sent an invitation. There's more today. I'm writing slowly. I'm not very sure when the next chapter will come out. You're tuning into the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.